The great forest of Bayatra, a colossal expanse rivaling the empire itself in size, was a domain far more hospitable to other races than it ever was to humans. Within this sprawling wilderness, locating a specific place was no easy feat. However, thanks to a map Andreas had obtained from Myuriel, he managed to navigate the dense forest and reach the intended destination without significant difficulty. At one point during their journey, Luna had asked how much farther they needed to go. Andreas replied that they were about halfway there. Observing the descending sun, he suggested they halt for the night and continue their trek in the morning. The following day, upon finally arriving at their destination, Luna stood in awe. She admitted that she hadn't believed such a place could actually exist. The way it was hidden deep within this impenetrable forest made it seem virtually undiscoverable. Even if someone had stumbled upon it before, she doubted they would have been able to acquire whatever lay inside. She speculated aloud that it might be a dragon's tomb, yet noted that it appeared to contain more than just that. There were things inside. Hearing her words, Andreas paused. Internally, he questioned what exactly she meant by things. Why had she used a vague term instead of simply saying a dragon corpse? The ambiguity concerned him. It could mean the place was dangerous. He was about to suggest they scout the area first when, to his astonishment, Luna walked straight through the portal without a second thought. Caught off guard and left with no other option, Andreas cursed under his breath and followed, resigning himself to whatever awaited them on the other side. As soon as he stepped through, the system's familiar voice echoed in his mind, announcing that he had discovered the scream of Krav Maga, the site of a dragon's death. That confirmation reassured him they had arrived at the correct location. However, the system followed up with another notification. He was now entering a hidden dungeon titled The Repeating Nightmare. That was when concern returned to him. He hadn't seen Luna since crossing the portal. Before he could call out, his surroundings shifted completely. He found himself in the middle of a city, its streets lively with children playing and chasing one another. The cheerful environment puzzled him. He glanced around in confusion, trying to understand how this could be a hidden dungeon. The system had declared this a place of death and nightmares, yet it resembled a bustling, cheerful town street. Just then, Luna's voice called out to him from a nearby rooftop. She asked where they were, and remarked with astonishment that this dungeon was unlike any she'd ever seen. Usually, dungeons were dark, eerie, and oppressive, but this one felt cheerful, almost fun. Relieved to see her safe, Andreas asked if she had noticed anything out of the ordinary. Luna leapt down from the rooftop and nodded, explaining that she had made a startling discovery. The people in this town were all ghosts. That revelation made Andreas freeze. He asked if she meant every single person here was dead. Luna confirmed it, adding that this was the first time she had encountered a place like this, an entire ghost town. Internally, Andreas reflected on the irony of the situation. They had come in search of a corpse, and yet they now found themselves surrounded by an entire settlement of the dead. Andreas spoke aloud, admitting that he wasn't entirely sure what connection this place had to the dragon's tomb, but reasoned that they needed to investigate before drawing any conclusions. Luna agreed, responding that it was time to begin a proper investigation. As the two began walking through the seemingly normal town, Andreas remarked that he believed they might be able to clear this dungeon like any other, by locating and destroying its core. However, he acknowledged that this one could be different, possibly tied in some way to the dragon they were seeking. Still, nothing was certain. They made their way around the village, eventually reaching the far side, only to discover a shimmering barrier blocking their path. It was a dead end, just like the other directions they had checked. Andreas quickly realized what this meant. Leaving the town was currently impossible. Seeing no other option, Andreas suggested they continue exploring. Luna agreed, and he pointed out how difficult it was to find any clues, especially considering how abruptly they had been transported here. He turned to ask Luna if she remembered anything just before the transition, any detail that might explain how they ended up in this strange place. But his words trailed off. A few feet ahead, Luna had become sidetracked, her attention fixed on something. Andreas followed her gaze and saw her watching a small stage where a theatrical play was unfolding. The performance depicted a valiant knight locked in battle with a dragon. Curious, Andreas joined her, thinking to himself that perhaps this reenactment could provide them with some useful clues. Suddenly, a voice called out to him. A villager who appeared to be a little tipsy approached and remarked that he hadn't seen Andreas around before. He asked if Andreas happened to be a mercenary. Playing along, Andreas confirmed that he was. The man shook his head and muttered that it was a shame if Andreas was hoping to join the Fire Dragon subjugation squad. He was a bit too late. They had already left the town several days ago. Intrigued, Andreas politely apologized and asked what exactly the Fire Dragon subjugation squad was. The villager seemed surprised that he didn't know. Andreas explained that he had only recently become a mercenary, hoping the excuse would be enough to justify his ignorance. The man nodded understandingly and said that, in that case, maybe it was a good thing he didn't know. Joining that mission could have been fatal for a beginner like him. Their attention then turned back to the play, as the villager pointed toward the stage, mentioning that it was a dramatization of the fire dragon subjugation. He explained that a fearsome fire dragon had recently built its lair near the town, and the high priest, Lord Lethe, fearing for the town's safety, had called for an expedition to slay the beast. Internally, Andreas began to wonder, could the fire dragon the man spoke of be Krav Maga, the same dragon whose death had led them to this dungeon? Curious, he asked the villager if by Lord Lethe he was referring to the ancient god known by that name. The villager looked puzzled by the phrasing and asked what he meant by ancient. He then clarified that Lord Lethe was the town's guardian deity, not some forgotten relic of the past. That was why, before the squad departed, they had received Lord Lethe's blessing. Hearing that, Andreas's mind began racing. A blessing from Lethe, given to dragon slayers. Such a scenario could only make sense in a time long past. Could it be that this town actually existed in the ancient age? He reminded himself that hidden dungeons were often linked to ancient ruins, and this one was beginning to show every sign of being exactly that. The probability that this place was once a real town from a forgotten era, one that had faced a fire dragon threat, was growing stronger by the second. The man then told Andreas that if he waited just a few more days, he would likely hear news from the expedition. No matter how powerful the dragon was, he assured, the squad had gone fully prepared. They were accompanied by 3 knights of exceptional strength, warriors renowned across the land, and most importantly, they carried the blessing of Lord Lethe. With all that on their side, the man claimed, the outcome was practically guaranteed. When the play concluded, and the fictional dragon was finally slain, Luna's eyes welled up with tears. It had moved her deeply. She confessed it was the first time in her life she had ever witnessed a theatrical performance. The emotions of the story, the bravery of the characters, and the triumphant ending had struck a chord within her. The villager turned back to Andreas and, with a friendly tone, remarked that although he may have missed out on joining the subjugation squad, he might as well enjoy himself now that he was here. Andreas nodded, thanked the man politely, and agreed. Internally, though, his thoughts were elsewhere. He recalled that dragons, when nearing the end of their lives, often chose a resting place where they would spend their final days. Such locations were referred to as dragon mounds. He thought back to the message the system had shown him upon entering this dungeon. The phrase, "a place where a dragon died," had stood out. At the time, something about it had felt off. But now, if the expedition had been real and successful, then it all made sense. This could very well be a dragon mound. As Luna wiped her tears, she turned to Andreas with a bright smile and said that the experience had been fun. Then, almost as if snapping out of a trance, she suddenly remembered that they were supposed to be conducting an investigation. Laughing lightly, she admitted she had completely forgotten. Andreas glanced at the darkening sky and told her it was getting late. They should find a place to stay for the night. Luna agreed and suggested they grab dinner too. She was completely exhausted from what she jokingly called their intense investigation. Curious, Andreas asked if that had really been her first time seeing a play. She nodded and explained that she was always on the run, constantly being chased, so she had never had a chance to watch one before. Just as he was about to ask who had been chasing her, both of them came to a sudden halt. A tall man had appeared before them, blocking their path. He looked directly at them and calmly spoke both of their names, Luna's real name and the false name Andreas had used during the Endeavour Orc raid. With narrowed eyes, the man asked what they were doing here. Instantly, Andreas's instincts kicked in. He had a strange feeling of familiarity when he looked at the man, but it was Luna who reacted with more intensity. There was a flicker of recognition and dread in her eyes. Nervously, she asked why the man was here. She sounded shaken. Both she and Andreas slowly shifted into a battle stance. Andreas, analyzing the situation internally, recalled that this man had a complicated history with Luna. In fact, he wasn't just her enemy, he was the longtime nemesis of Luna's mother, Millennium, a legendary black mage, Evan von Orlean. One of the continent's 10 greats, a formidable warrior feared by black mages everywhere, known especially as the natural enemy of black magic users. Evan gave Luna a smirk and remarked that she had grown up. He asked how many years it had been since they last saw each other. But Luna, her voice filled with venom, shouted at him to stop speaking to her so casually. She declared flatly that she hated him. Evan simply chuckled at her reaction and called her cold. Then, with a grin, he added that when he heard about her being involved in the Endeavour Orc raid, they had no idea how much trouble it had caused him. Andreas, on the other hand, was silently cursing. He thought that if he was the only one hiding his identity, it wouldn't cause much trouble. Never in his wildest thoughts did he expect someone as dangerous as Evan to show up in a place like this. Out of nowhere, black smoke began surrounding them, and it looked like it was seeping out from the villagers themselves. Evan noticed it too, his expression hardening as he demanded they tell him what exactly was going on. It was at that moment Andreas realized what was happening. The people were actually turning into smoke. Evan calmly stated that it seemed to be a rather special kind of magic, but said it didn't matter. He explained that he was only there to purge the black mages and leave. Then he drew his blade, and it began glowing with intense light, completely shocking Andreas. The light from the blade wasn't just bright, it was actually erasing the black smoke entirely. Andreas attempted to block the incoming attack, but to his disbelief, his hand got sliced clean off. Luna, witnessing the whole thing, lost it. Furious, she shouted out Andreas's real name and rushed at Evan. But before she could land a hit, Evan delivered a brutal punch that sent her flying like a rag doll. Andreas, holding his bleeding arm, called out her name in panic, but before he could even move, a blade pierced straight through his chest. Evan, standing behind him, muttered his real name, Andreas, and mockingly said that now he understood. Very nice. The name he used on the Orc raid was just a fake name all along. Inside his mind, Andreas was in disbelief. He couldn't even see it coming. Was this really where it all ended for him? Suddenly, everything around him began to blur and rewind, until a strange, eerie voice echoed in the darkness. A figure stepped forward, its presence unsettling, and it said that it couldn't bear to watch any longer. Not only had Andreas fallen for a pathetic illusion, but now he was about to be killed by mere humans. The figure found his weakness. Truly astounding. It stood right in front of Andreas as he asked it who it was. The figure just laughed, asking if Andreas still had enough strength left to act tough. Then it said they'd soon see whether Andreas could actually escape this place. The figure bent down, picked up Andreas's severed hand, and casually handed it to him, saying, "Take it. It's something you left behind." Just then, Andreas's eyes jolted open. He was sweating, gasping for breath, and completely disoriented. But what stunned him even more was realizing where he was. He was back at the same exact spot he first appeared in when he entered the dungeon. Everything around him was happening just like it had before. 2 kids were playing exactly like they did the first time. That's when it hit him. Time was repeating. He called it a nightmare on repeat. Then he remembered what the system had called this place, a repeating nightmare. Now it finally made sense. The dungeon wasn't just dangerous, it was looping time itself. At that very moment, Luna appeared and threw her arms around him, thanking the heavens he was still alive. She said she had no idea what she would have done if he hadn't been there. He grabbed her and asked what had happened to her. She looked just as confused and said she didn't really know either. She explained that after Evan hit her, she collapsed, then everything went misty, and after that, she remembered nothing. Andreas thought to himself that this must mean she didn't die and come back like he did. Luna then added that when she woke up, she found herself back at the starting point of the dungeon. Just in case, she'd searched the area, and that's when she found him. Andreas couldn't shake the memory of that eerie figure's words, deceived by a useless illusion and killed by mere humans. As he glanced around at the bustling marketplace, his eyes narrowed. He quietly muttered to Luna that it felt like the town was stuck in a loop, endlessly repeating the same day. Luna questioned whether such a thing was even possible, but Andreas confirmed his suspicion. He speculated that it might be the result of some kind of magic. The odd part, he added, was that nobody else seemed aware of it. Only he and Luna retained their memories once the day reset. When Luna asked if by the end he meant they actually died, Andreas admitted that it was one possibility, but he also wondered if the loop restarted at midnight. Either way, he found it strange that Evan, who hadn't died, was still present. The situation unsettled him. At that moment, Evan strolled under one of the village arches, murmuring to himself that the place lay outside the god's favor and would soon need purifying. Andreas and Luna instinctively shifted into a battle stance, but Evan, with a calm and serious tone, assured them there was no need to be so tense. If he had truly wanted to kill them, he said, he would have done so already. Luna wasn't convinced. She reminded him sharply that he had attacked them not too long ago. Andreas didn't really follow Evan's reasoning and asked if he was seriously suggesting some sort of temporary truce. Evan responded in that same unnerving tone, saying it was a reasonable suggestion, especially coming from someone impure. Andreas, not backing down, made a proposal. He suggested that each of them investigate the town separately and meet back at the same spot when the day restarted to share their findings. Luna looked like she wanted to protest. She clearly didn't trust Evan, but just as she opened her mouth, the paladin abruptly cut in with a mocking remark. "What a strategist, huh, Andreas?" Andreas blinked, caught off guard, having no idea what that meant. Luna clenched her teeth, clearly irritated. Evan, on the other hand, addressed the issue directly. He asked what assurance they had that Andreas wouldn't simply vanish if he found an exit. If he did, wouldn't he just take Luna and leave? Andreas smirked and pointed out that maybe Evan should have acted more like a gentleman during their first encounter. That way, trusting him now wouldn't be such a challenge. Inwardly, Andreas told himself to just let it slide this time, suspicious as Evan was. Evan turned his head slightly and responded with a cryptic tone, claiming they were clearly misunderstanding something. The paladin's expression hardened further. Then came the unsettling declaration. If Evan truly wanted to, he could kill both of them the moment they woke up each day. Both Andreas and Luna froze at the words, eyes widening. Andreas, however, didn't look afraid. He looked intrigued. With a mischievous grin, he agreed to the truce, saying, "All right, let's work together." Luna was appalled. "No way!" she snapped. But Andreas continued, clearly enjoying himself. He teased Evan, saying he didn't expect to end up arguing with a brainless knight and called him stubborn. Evan clicked his tongue in annoyance at their bickering. In response, Andreas shrugged and told him that if he was so suspicious, he could simply trail him from a distance. With his skill set, hiding his presence shouldn't be difficult. That's when the air around Evan shifted completely. His deep blue eyes darkened, and a heavy silence fell over them, almost crushing in its weight. Without another word, Evan turned and began walking away. As he left them behind, he stated calmly, "Well, it doesn't seem like this'll be resolved any time soon. Let's just watch for now and see if anything promising shows up." Luna, visibly enraged, made an obscene gesture toward Evan while cursing him out with zero hesitation. Andreas, on the other hand, let out a relieved sigh and muttered to himself that he had honestly thought Evan was about to attack. A single bead of tension rolled down his cheek as he called out to Luna, saying that they definitely needed to find an exit before Evan did. Luna, nearly on the verge of tears just thinking about it, whimpered out, "Partner!" Luna really hates that guy, her tone full of whining frustration. Andreas commented that they were only forming this alliance out of pure necessity, not trust. As they resumed walking through the ruins, Luna's curiosity got the better of her, and she asked where they were headed. Andreas explained that he'd heard rumors about a priest from Leafy requesting a dragon hunt. That memory brought to mind a location they had passed the day before. Eventually they arrived at a massive, towering temple. Unbeknownst to them, Evan was trailing them like a shadow. He eventually spoke up, commenting on the structure ahead. "Ah, the temple. Oh, heavens. Perhaps we should have decided on our search zones first." Luna and Andreas turned to look at him as he continued, stating that without coordination, splitting up to investigate would be meaningless. Andreas responded that they had only come to this location because it seemed the most suspicious. Luna, irritated, grumbled that Evan had been following them the entire time. She muttered that they might as well check this place first before heading somewhere else. Suddenly, a man standing guard at the temple entrance interrupted them, asking Luna if she might be a priestess of Lord Nyx. She looked puzzled and was about to say no, but Andreas quickly placed a hand over her mouth. Flashing a polite smile, he told the man that he was absolutely correct. The man nodded and remarked that it seemed they had come to meet the priest. Andreas didn't waste any time and immediately asked if they could have an audience with her. The man responded politely but firmly, explaining that the priest didn't receive visitors who weren't followers. He then asked if Luna could have her guards wait outside for a moment. Luna looked at Andreas in surprise, clearly unsure of what was going on. Yet the two seemed to exchange a silent understanding through nothing but eye contact. Luna thought to herself that she didn't really get what was happening, but figured all she had to do was go along with it. Andreas leaned in and whispered, "Yes, go in and find out who the high priest is." Without another word, Luna ran into the temple. Meanwhile, Andreas stood there thinking. Even that gatekeeper had eyes that looked just like Luna's. What exactly was Luna's connection to the priestess of Nyx? Right then, Evan broke the silence, stating with certainty that dark mages were especially skilled at lying. Andreas raised an eyebrow, turning slightly to face him, as he told him to quit provoking everyone in this situation. Evan replied smoothly that his words were meant to be kind, and added that he would be more careful. He then said that once they left the temple, he would carry out his duty as an inquisitor. He lamented the fact that he hadn't been able to purify that child and her mother with his own hands. Andreas looked at him, visibly skeptical and somewhat irritated, and said he wouldn't question Evan's duties. However, he made it clear that he'd rather deal with a lying dark mage than someone obsessed with hunting down a child. At those words, Evan's expression darkened, his brow furrowed deeply. He muttered that such talk was blasphemy against the gods. Suddenly, the temple doors burst open with a tremendous force, releasing a pressure so intense it sent Andreas's hair whipping back. Both he and Evan turned quickly to see what was going on. Without hesitation, Andreas bolted forward, gripping his sword tightly and shouting Luna's name. The guards immediately reacted, unsheathing their blades and shouting, "Step aside! Unauthorized individuals are not permitted inside!" Behind Andreas, the Lord Orc's aura surged with a guttural roar, overwhelming everything in its path. The sheer intensity of it hit hard. His eyes began to glow red as he growled, "Get out of the way!" Startled, the guards screamed, their eyes wide with fear. But as Andreas passed between them, the force of his presence alone caused both of them to faint on the spot, unable to endure the overwhelming pressure. Andreas sprinted forward, panic swirling in his thoughts. What the hell is happening? He wondered, desperate for answers. When he reached the temple's interior, a golden cedar tree stood prominently in the middle of a dense cloud of black smoke. Andreas stopped in his tracks, eyes wide in disbelief. The sight before him was unreal. In the next instant, Luna came flying out of the smoke, thrown violently by its force. She tried to brace herself, but ended up crashing straight into Andreas. He barely caught her, then quickly asked if she was all right. To his surprise, Luna beamed with joy the moment she saw him. "Huh? It's you, partner. Looks like we hit the jackpot this time." Up ahead, the black smoke continued to spread, revealing an elderly man who stood his ground, gritting his teeth. His expression was furious as he pointed his staff at them and shouted, You impure beings! How did you manage to infiltrate this sacred city ruled by Lady Leith? Leave now!" Veins bulged on the old man's face from rage, but Luna turned to Andreas, as if trying to give him a hint or signal. "Partner, that's a real human." Andreas smiled knowingly. "I see. So it was you. You're the one tampering with time in this city." The old man began to stutter, visibly shaken. What are you talking about? I don't have that kind of power." Then, breaking into manic laughter, he declared, "It's all thanks to Lady Leth's power. Worship her. Lady Lethe granted us eternal life." At that moment, Evan casually began entering the temple. "So, this black smoke, is it supposed to be the work of a god?" he asked slowly. The man appeared puzzled by the phrase black smoke, but after a pause, he began laughing again. "Ha ha! That smoke is the sign of a miracle. It proves the humans here have been blessed. It's the sacred work of God." Evan, however, remained unconvinced. His expression serious, he said that God is light itself and could never create something so dark and twisted. Those words only fueled the old man's fury. "Evil? You dare call it evil, you—" But Evan didn't let him finish. Andreas cut in first, telling Evan to hold off. "Let's start by getting information from him first," he suggested. The man didn't seem too interested in their back and forth. Instead, he raised his voice again. "I won't hand over this city, even if it all began with my own mistakes. In the end, they're alive because of me." The three of them froze for a moment, stunned by the sudden confession. The old man raised his head high, confidence returning to his voice. "There's nothing you can do to stop me." His staff began to glow a deep crimson, and the stones around it pulsed with the same red energy. Andreas narrowed his eyes, uneasy. This guy. Could it be? Then it happened. Without warning, the old man collapsed. His staff clattered to the ground, and a wave of blood spread rapidly across the floor, splashing against a nearby stone. It was over. The man was dead. Some time passed. Still shocked, Luna knelt beside the lifeless body. Her voice was quiet and somber as she said, "It's no use. His soul is already gone. There's nothing left behind. We won't find anything this way." Andreas, staring at the body, asked, "You mean his soul has already returned?" Evan, now standing behind them, commented with a grim tone. He said it was clear the priest was the one keeping the city trapped in this time loop. He was the reason everyone was still alive. Luna didn't want to accept it. She turned her head away and muttered with a pout, Yeah, I get it." Evan added, "But the real mystery is still unsolved. We don't know how he was able to reverse time in the first place." Claiming it to be the power of God might have sounded absurd, but there was no denying that reversing time was a power beyond the ordinary, something truly transcendent. Still, it didn't seem like the old man had the ability to control such a force on his own. That meant the source had to be external, perhaps a device or some sort of special artifact. Evan began scanning the area carefully, eyes flicking across every shadow and stone. Andreas, watching him, guessed aloud that it was probably connected to the dungeon's core. Unfortunately, they didn't have enough clues to pinpoint it. Meanwhile, Luna was squishing her own cheeks in frustration and asked what they should do next. Even she didn't seem too confident about what came next. At that point, Evan suggested they consider exploring parts of the city they hadn't yet visited. However, he quickly dismissed the idea himself, saying it would likely be a waste of time. Luna blinked at him, clearly confused and wanting to know why. Evan explained bluntly that the fastest method was to capture the priest alive after the day reset, then extract the needed information from him. Without warning, Evan raised his sword to his neck and calmly added, "Until next time," before slashing his own throat and collapsing to the ground. Luna and Andreas froze in place, completely stunned. A dead silence fell over the temple like a curtain of awkward tension. Luna crossed her arms, annoyed. "It's satisfying," she muttered, "but also kind of irritating." Andreas watched Evan's body and thought to himself that while waiting until evening did feel like a waste, the man's lack of hesitation was something else. Shortly after, Luna picked up her scythe, its blade glowing with a bright green shimmer. In a chipper tone, she asked, "So, should we get to work too?" Andreas broke into a cold sweat. The way she said that made it sound like this was some kind of game. Why do I feel like she's actually enjoying this? Honestly, do you even think before you act? He wondered. Embarrassed, he suggested they continue searching the temple. "Evan might have been onto something. We need more info," he told her. Luna's eyes sparkled. "Partner, you're a genius." The afternoon wore on, and the bodies still lay undisturbed at the temple's entrance, as if nothing unusual had occurred. Andreas approached Luna and sighed, saying, "We're not finding many clues, are we?" Luna didn't seem too worried. "It's fine. If we fail today, we can just try again tomorrow after Evan dies." Facing her, Andreas looked serious. "We can't keep doing this forever." That confused Luna. "Huh? Why not? Time just resets anyway." But as people around them began dissolving into smoke again, Andreas reminded her that they had no idea what was happening with time outside the dungeon. Luna didn't seem convinced. "Is that really important?" she asked. Andreas, however, had a quiet weight in his voice when he said that outside the dungeon he had people he needed to protect. That response caught Luna off guard. and an awkward silence settled between them. As the mist began to roll in, Andreas gave her a final look and said goodbye. The next day they reunited again and decided to head back to the temple as fast as they could. Luna, full of determination, declared, "Don't worry, Luna will definitely catch him, partner." When they arrived at the site, they saw the two temple guards already unconscious on the ground. It was clearly Evan's doing. Standing before the temple door, everything felt eerily quiet. Ahead of them, Evan stood completely still, like a statue. Luna frowned and asked sharply, "Come on, why'd you kill him before even trying to get information?" Andreas studied the scene, observing Evan closely. He came to a different conclusion. "It looks like he took his own life again. Probably realized we were right behind him." Luna let out an exasperated sigh. "You can't just act without thinking." But Andreas shook his head. Evan did not kill him. Before either of them could say more, Evan suddenly took a deep breath and cut into their conversation. "This will be a long battle," he said, "until we meet again." Luna, completely fed up, yelled out, "That guy passed us again!" While all this was going on, Andreas figured they might just keep going until one of them finally gave in. It was such a blunt approach, but he knew he couldn't just sit there doing nothing either. So simple. But I can't afford to stay still, he thought to himself. Glancing over at Luna, he said, "I want to find a smarter way, but for now, let's go with something quicker." They parted ways once again, and the day repeated itself just like all the others. There they were again, standing in front of the temple, stuck in the same cycle over and over. On the third run, everyone was dead again. Then it happened the 10th time, the 47th, the 83rd, every time the same outcome, each one of them ending their own life. After the 120th round, Andreas stopped keeping count. No matter how often it happened, he could never get used to the horror of doing this to himself. The feeling of disgust clung to him, and the growing frustration from the never-changing results gnawed at his mind. What made it worse was not knowing how much time had passed outside the dungeon. The conclusion of the great sin was creeping closer, and he hated not being out there with the people he needed to protect. Then, on one of those endless attempts, when the three of them reached the temple again, they were greeted by a chilling message written in blood across the ground. "You're all trapped. There's nothing you can do." Evan looked at it calmly, though something in his expression looked twisted and unsettled. "He's toying with us completely now," he said. "To go this far just to mess with us. He even ripped off his own arm." Andreas had had enough. His whole body tensed up as cold sweat slid down his back and his teeth clenched hard. Then, in a burst of rage, he roared with everything he had. "You bastard!" He couldn't take it anymore. His anger boiled over, and he drew his sword, swinging it through the air with such force that it kicked up a whirlwind of dust. Evan stood silently, not needing to say anything. Meanwhile, Andreas stood there breathing heavily, completely drained. "Damn it! What am I even supposed to do?" he muttered. But just as that fury started to fade into helplessness, Luna walked up to him and gently wrapped her arms around him. With her eyes closed, as if trying to quiet the storm inside her friend, she whispered, "Today, let's not kill ourselves." Sometime later, the scorching sun was beating down on a small tavern where Andreas and the others had taken a break. Luna, clearly still annoyed, said to Evan, "Luna already told you it's a waste of time for you, so why are you tagging along?" Evan took a long breath before answering. "Let's just say I'm here to keep an eye on the two of you." He turned to one of the bartenders and casually added, "Can I get the strongest drink you've got?" That pushed Luna right over the edge. She slammed her hand on the table, totally irritated. Andreas raised an eyebrow and asked, "Is that really something a holy paladin should be doing?" Evan replied without flinching, "Nope, it's totally forbidden." But then he poured himself a beer and calmly added, "I figure the all-merciful God will probably let it slide this time. I mean, after dying over 100 times, a mug of beer doesn't seem like a big deal." He poured another glass and offered it to Andreas, who took it in silence, his eyes looking off to the side. Inwardly, Andreas was stunned. "I can't believe a guy as serious as him would say something like that." Evan raised his glass like he was making a toast and said, "Since we've died together now, let's drink like it too." Luna squinted at him and mumbled, "I think dying that many times broke something in his brain, though, honestly, he's easier to deal with like this than when he was all uptight." Before she could go on, Andreas stepped in. "Let's just drink, Luna, for now." Luna took a deep breath, like the situation was really stressing her out. Evan, meanwhile, stared at her with an annoyed look. After that, they all took a drink. The moment the knight took his first sip, he let the glass slip from his hand. It spilled across the table, and he immediately passed out cold. Andreas froze, shocked. In his mind, he was yelling, "What the hell?" One of the strongest knights on the entire continent had collapsed after just one drink. Luna, on the other hand, lit up with excitement. She saw an opportunity. Andreas glanced at her, trying to figure out what was going on, and saw her standing up with a cheerful and slightly suspicious grin. She suddenly said, "Just this once, let's do it, let's kill him." Without thinking, Andreas jumped in and blocked her attack. "Luna, are you drunk? Please calm down," he told her firmly. Luna blinked, confused about why they couldn't just do it. To her, it made sense. Everyone would just come back to life anyway. Andreas replied seriously, saying they shouldn't be doing stuff like that to each other, even if they did revive. She swallowed hard, her face turning red from his words. An awkward silence hung in the air. Then, without warning, Luna grabbed Andreas's cheeks and started squishing and massaging them. With a sweet and teasing tone, she told him, "Friend, you're way too serious. You know, sometimes even the things you try so hard to protect can still slip away. Are the people you care about really so weak that they can't survive without you?" Her words caught Andreas off guard. They stirred something inside him, mixed feelings he wasn't ready for. Luna kept going, saying, "Look, even Luna is still alive, right? Of course, that's only because Mommy protected Luna. But still." At that moment, Andreas started thinking deeply. She had a point. They were all strong, maybe even at the level of main characters. Maybe it was arrogant of him to think they needed his protection all the time. His thoughts were cut off when Luna suddenly screamed. She put a hand on her forehead and said, "But Luna was protected by Mommy, so we need to leave quickly so you can protect the others." The White Paladin was still knocked out cold, so Andreas took a long breath and tried to calm himself down. He reminded himself that his friends weren't that weak. Luna was surprised and asked if he really believed that. Andreas nodded and told her yes. Then he suggested they explore the city for a bit to help sober up. Just then, Evan slowly opened his eyes without a word, like he had been awake the whole time. Later, Andreas and Luna walked through the village streets. She asked where they were going, and Andreas said he wanted to check out the temple again before the sun went down. She looked at him curiously. "Why? The old guy is already dead." Andreas reminded her that the first time, they had rushed in and tried to catch the killer as fast as possible. But this time, he wanted to find the murder weapon. He didn't believe the man could have caused the dungeon events by himself. When they arrived at the scene of the massacre, he explained that there was probably a magical catalyst involved. Luna pointed out that maybe it wasn't even in that spot. Andreas looked around for a bit, then said, "Now that I think about it, no matter how fast we get here, the old man is always already dead. That means this place is both where he's reborn and where the magic gets triggered. There's a good chance the secret is hidden here." Just then, Luna shouted in alarm, "Look, there's black mist coming out of the spot you destroyed earlier." A dense black mist began to spread across the area. Andreas reacted instantly, grabbing his sword and stepping forward as he told Luna to stay back. With a confident smile, he said it looked like coming here had been the right call. Luna, clearly thrilled, cheered him on with excitement. "Go for it, friend! Break it!" A loud explosion rang out, shaking the area. As the smoke slowly cleared, both of them noticed something strange. Hidden underneath all that mist were stairs leading down into a deeper level. The whole place was still cloaked in heavy black smoke. Without hesitation or fear, Luna dashed toward the stairs, shouting, "Bingo! Let's go down!" But Andreas quickly reached out and stopped her. He suggested they wait until the mist cleared a bit more, pointing out that the mist might be connected to the time loop. The two began discussing how thick the mist was and whether Evan's light might help get rid of it. Andreas went quiet, his face tensing with deep thought. In his mind he wondered, "Light, huh? If I'm not wrong, the spell should be..." Before he could finish the thought, he managed to focus enough power to create a small, glowing flame in his hand. Luna's eyes lit up when she saw it. Wow, how did you do that? She asked, completely amazed. At that moment, a system notification popped up. Talent acquired, magic power, light element genius. Andreas remembered the moment back in his office when he had received that message. It was a reward for clearing the Tower of Modras. He figured that must be why he could use light magic now. Luna was beyond excited and begged him to teach her how to do it too. But Andreas told her it was his first time, and that was about all he could manage for now. He stretched his arms forward and silently wished he had taken time to practice before. The small light was enough. It pushed the dense mist aside and lit up a narrow path that led to a solid stone wall. Andreas began to descend the stairs cautiously, warning Luna to be careful since the steps were extremely steep. Naturally, Luna didn't listen. She skipped down the steps like it was nothing, full of energy and with no sign of caution. Once they reached the bottom, they were surrounded by pitch blackness. That's when they both heard something. A faint whisper. Living beings. Luna turned to Andreas and asked if he had heard it too. He nodded, confirming that something was definitely there. As they moved forward slowly, the voice returned, this time clearer. Set me free. Andreas felt uneasy. Luna, on the other hand, was stunned. She told him there was someone up ahead. Then she asked, Can you make the light a little brighter? Andreas wasn't sure he could. He was already struggling just to keep the light going, but he decided to give it a try. He brought his hands together and pushed his focus to the limit, thinking, just keeping this tiny light alive is hard enough. Can I really make it stronger? He began concentrating deeply, trying to strip away the heat from the fire spell, rearrange the light and refine it. He repeated the process over and over in his mind, pushing through each step carefully. Magical circles started to form around his hands as the spell took shape. Then, all at once, the light burst out, spreading farther than before and cutting through the mist like a blade. Wow! Incredible, Luna said, her eyes wide with awe. Andreas could hardly believe what they saw next. Right in front of them, a massive red dragon lay curled up, its wings wrapped tightly around its body. Is that a dragon? Luna stammered. Andreas stood frozen. He had only heard stories, but now it was real, Krav Maga. So this was where it had been hiding all along. The dragon was trapped in that space, resting quietly as the black mist surged around it. Suddenly the fog began to thicken again, spreading even faster. We need to get out of here, now, Andreas warned. But just as he said that, a powerful gust of wind rose up, shaking the chamber. Andreas clenched his jaw, realizing he could barely keep the small light active under this pressure. Luna felt it too. The light was fading fast, and the pressure around them kept growing. But this was the best Andreas could manage for now. As the light faded and the wind grew stronger, darkness swallowed everything. Just like that, the loop restarted. The sound of loud bells echoed through the air. Children laughed and chased each other, fighting over a toy. Andreas found himself back at the familiar fountain. That's when Luna's voice rang out, full of energy. She was calling to him again. "Friend, hurry up!" she shouted, running toward him in a panic. "Come on, let's go with Evan too." Andreas stayed seated, calm as ever. He looked at her and said, "Luna, let's not tell Evan what happened today." Luna blinked in confusion, clearly not understanding why. He explained, "We might be working together right now, but don't forget, he still wants to kill us." But the truth was, Andreas had other thoughts weighing on him. Deep down, he was only thinking, first, we need to figure out how to escape this place ourselves. Meanwhile, back at the cave, the light they had created had been so intense that it shone even beyond the entrance. The priest's body and Evan's lay on the ground nearby, both unmoving. Luna shielded her eyes from the brightness, shouting for Andreas to keep it going. With a big grin on her face, she yelled, "The light's even stronger than before!" Through the glow, they saw the dragon's huge body, still curled up. But then Luna noticed something odd. She turned quickly and pointed. "There! There's something on its chest!" Andreas narrowed his eyes and said, "That has to be its core. Destroy it." Without hesitation, Luna nodded and launched herself forward, lifting her scythe and aiming directly at the dragon's chest. A thunderous crash echoed through the area as she struck. The impact kicked up a heavy cloud of dust. Luna swallowed nervously as Andreas called out to her, clearly concerned. When the dust began to settle, the core was still there, glowing red and completely unharmed. Andreas, now at his limit, let out a tired breath. Looks like we'll have to leave this for next time. The next day, both of them were once again running toward the temple. The heart, Andreas muttered, thinking about what Luna had said. She nodded. Yeah, it was glowing red. Grinding his teeth in frustration, Andreas realized something. If even Luna's attacks couldn't break it, there's no way the two of us can do it alone. Then an idea hit him. He turned to Luna and said, "Let's ask Evan for help." She didn't answer right away, her expression unsure. Andreas noticed her hesitation. "You don't like the idea, huh?" he asked. "Well, for now, let's just focus on getting out of here." At that same moment, Evan stood in front of the temple. He was preparing himself, hand gripping his sword, ready to draw it as always. Around him the guards were already down. Just as he was about to push the temple doors open, a voice rang out. "Wait, Evan!" someone shouted. Evan paused, turning sharply to see who had called him. His eyes narrowed when he spotted Andreas and Luna rushing toward him. Luna waved her hands as she kept shouting, "We found the core!" Evan didn't waste a second. "Where is it?" he demanded, but Andreas stepped in, raising a hand. "Before I tell you, I need you to promise me something." Evan tilted his head, confused. "Promise?" he repeated, unsure where this was going. Andreas took a deep breath, his tone serious. "Once we get out of this dungeon, you won't come after Luna or me for 1 whole month." Evan didn't respond right away. He just stared, analyzing the request carefully. Luna leaned in close to Andreas, covering her mouth as she whispered, "See, I told you it was impossible. Look at his face. He hates this idea." But to their surprise, Evan answered plainly, "All right." Both Luna and Andreas froze, eyes wide. They hadn't expected him to actually agree. Andreas gave a small smile and said, "It's a promise with a holy night after all. I'll trust you." The trio stood at the threshold of the site, but something felt off compared to the previous visits. Luna noticed it first, pointing toward the entrance and noting that there was no sign of the priest's body. She remarked that it didn't really matter whether he was there or not. Their main goal was still to destroy the core. Evan, gripping his sword with steady resolve, agreed. He suggested that the priest had most likely run away the moment he realized their victory was inevitable. Yet Andreas didn't appear fully convinced. Although he admitted the logic made sense, something still unsettled him. Then, without warning, a furious voice echoed behind them, forcing all three to turn quickly. The priest stood there, enraged, demanding to know why they insisted on destroying the city when he had given them a chance to integrate into the world. Andreas responded with venom, calling the priest a fool and questioning the point of endlessly repeating a world that had already met its end. The priest shouted back, still filled with righteous fury, insisting that their continued existence was meaningful, that even God had granted them forgiveness. Andreas, seizing the moment, pushed further, asking whether the priest genuinely believed that, or if he was just trying to convince himself. The priest shouted at him to be silent, but Andreas pressed on, accusing him of pushing the youth to fight against the fire dragon, an effort that ended in complete failure. Each of Andreas's words struck a nerve, and the priest kept yelling for him to shut up. But Andreas didn't back down. He pointed out the grim reality. The city had likely been obliterated in an instant, without regard to age or gender. That kind of destruction could only have come from a reckless expedition, one led by the very man standing before them. As Luna listened to Andreas's accusations, the weight of his words hit her hard. A vivid image filled her mind. A raging dragon tearing through the city, leaving nothing but ruin behind. The priest, perhaps trying to justify his actions, mumbled something about Lady Lethe having performed a miracle on the land. But Andreas wasn't done. he scoffed, comparing the so-called miracle to a curse, like a child waiting forever for a father who would never return. The priest's patience snapped. He clenched his teeth and declared that Lady Lethe was merciful, fair, and just. Then he raised his staff and slammed it into the earth. A deep rumble followed, and from the ground surged a thick black mist. Cracks formed rapidly across the stone, and then, in a blinding flash, the massive red dragon appeared. It roared in fury, its awakening shaking the earth beneath their feet and throwing the trio off balance. Luna cried out, pointing at the beast. Evan, his eyes widening, asked if this was the enemy they had to face. Andreas confirmed it, explaining that the dragon's core was embedded deep within its chest. He also warned them to watch for the black smoke swirling around them. The dragon reared back, flames gathering in its throat as it prepared to release its devastating fire breath. Andreas rushed to Luna's side, urging her to be cautious. In an instant, the dragon unleashed its flames, reducing everything in their path to ash. Andreas threw up a wall of black energy to protect them, while Luna braced behind her shield. Evan stood his ground, enduring the scorching wave that swept over the battlefield. Then something strange happened. Luna was no longer herself. In her place stood Eve Millennium, her expression calm and familiar. She looked at Evan and smiled warmly, greeting him as if no time had passed. Evan's heart skipped a beat. Shocked, he asked how she could possibly be there. Now seemed shaken. His voice, once calm and measured, had risen in volume, a change that didn't go unnoticed by Andreas. What stood out even more was how rattled Evan became when Eve, with a warm smile, commented on Luna's growth, saying she had grown into a fine young woman. Evan responded, his voice strained, that it had never been easy for him to raise his hand against a child, but that it was no longer necessary. The tension between them only grew. Sensing that things were escalating at the worst possible moment, Andreas stepped in, trying to ground them back to the crisis at hand. Just then the priest's voice rang out with renewed intensity. He declared that Lady Lethe, known for justice and fairness, had punished the wicked beast that had burned God's children and had then hidden away. Using divine power, the priest claimed, Lady Lethe had revived the land through the beast's heart and gifted the people eternal life. Behind him, the mighty red dragon stirred, its aura swelling with divine energy. Eve swiftly raised her hand, which shimmered with green mana, and challenged the priest's words, asking if this twisted existence was truly what he considered eternal life. Andreas observed that, even in the absence of light, the black smoke surrounding them had begun to thin. Luna's body shivered involuntarily. She could hear the anguished screams of countless souls. It was cruel, she thought, for a god to trap his own children in an endless flow of time. High atop the dragon, the priest remained momentarily silent, as if taking in Eve's challenge, but her words only stoked his fury. His voice dripped with hatred as he hissed, You witch priestess! I'll deal with you first!" With a roar, the dragon released another surge of blazing fire. The trio instinctively moved back, unsure where the attack was aimed. Then the priest shouted, his voice echoing through the smoke and flame, "I will return!" The dragon's breath engulfed the temple gates and fire quickly spread through the entire village. Panic erupted as chaos consumed the area. Eve turned to Evan, urgency in her tone. "I'll handle the smoke. You take him down." But Evan hesitated, stubbornly claiming he didn't need help. Despite his tough words, Eve gazed at him softly, a look filled with familiarity, as though she had known him for far longer than she let on. Evan tightened his grip on his sword, now glowing with brilliant intensity, but before either of them could act, something unexpected happened. Both of them widened their eyes in disbelief. A colossal portal materialized behind the priest, pulsing with otherworldly energy. From within stepped Timur and Rudolph. "Is that a giant corpse?" Evan muttered, stunned. Andreas's summoned creatures jumped over the huge red dragon, ready to attack. The dragon was at least 3 times bigger than the already giant-sized monsters. The priest looked up, clearly angry. Eve stood there, shocked by what she was seeing. She whispered, "So giants really do exist?" Even the dead body of the Tiger King, Timer, couldn't take away the surprise in her eyes. She could only wonder who Andreas Cromwell really was. Next to her, Andreas noticed people staring at him as he calmly gave orders to his summons. Timur and Rudolph launched attack after attack at the dragon, but nothing seemed to work. Their blows didn't even leave a mark. The priest burst out laughing, knowing it was useless. "They're just corpses. They can't even scratch it," he said while holding his staff high. Suddenly, thick black smoke started to spread everywhere, confusing both Tima and Rudolph. Andreas's eyes went wide as he swallowed hard. The mist, he thought. Something was clearly going wrong, and it shook him. The people nearby, watching everything happen, could feel the chaos in the air. But to his shock, the mist didn't hurt the undead. Rudolph stood in front of the red dragon while the city behind him burned to the ground, completely swallowed by flames. The priest shouted, "If the mist doesn't work on them, then nothing can hurt a dragon's skin. This won't make any difference." But Andreas didn't seem bothered. He looked straight at the priest and said calmly, "You called the mist God's power, right? Then what's this? You're nothing but a servant of a dragon's dead body." The priest bit his lip and squinted, nearly losing his cool. Andreas had a way of really getting under his skin. Behind them, Eve looked over at the paladin and said with a smirk, "Luna's friend is better at trash talk than you, huh?" Evan stayed silent. He was watching everything closely. Seeing those corpses, who were supposed to be dead, walking around again made his stomach turn. He gripped his sword tight as it began to glow, and then he finished his thought out loud. "It's truly disgusting." In the next second, Evan snapped. He lost control. His sword flashed as he lifted it above his head, his eyes full of fire and purpose. He swung it down hard, and a bright light shot through the battlefield. The dragon let out a deep, shaking roar. The red glow from its chest, its core, started to shine even brighter. Evan's light spread across the whole area like a wave. Andreas had to raise his arm to shield his face from the blinding blast. This is Evan's real power, Andreas thought, both surprised and impressed. But the priest didn't stop laughing. It was almost creepy. A shield had formed around the dragon, leaving it untouched. The priest howled with laughter and yelled, "As long as the dragon's heart is here, all your efforts are useless." Even though he acted confident deep inside, he was shaking. These people had gotten way too close to breaking through. Eve turned to Evan and said, "It's tough, huh?" She explained that ancient books say dragon skin can't be hurt by regular attacks, and its heart doesn't even react to aura or magic. The paladin didn't care. He grumbled that if something was that hard to break, then he just needed to hit it harder. Without warning, he charged forward at full speed, holding his sword tight. Andreas spotted him and narrowed his eyes. "Dumb musclehead," he muttered in his mind. Then he shouted, "Tima! Rudo! Fall back for now!" The dragon lifted one of its giant claws, ready to slam down hard. At that moment, the priest shouted from above so everyone could hear, "I don't know what you're trying to do, but let's see if you can survive this earthquake." The three of them were caught off guard by the sudden threat. The dragon's huge claw slammed down onto the ground, making a loud, booming crash. Dust and pieces of the ground flew everywhere from the impact. Right away, the trio jumped to the sides to dodge the blow. The priest sneered and muttered, "That guy, he's the most annoying one." He was talking about Evan, who had already leapt high into the air above him. Evan looked down at the dragon, surprised, as it opened its mouth again. Fiery energy started to gather. A huge blast came out like a giant tunnel made of fire. Andreas and Eve quickly grew worried about what that blast could do. But while the dragon was focused on Evan, Andreas noticed something, a chance to attack. He moved fast, forming a summoning magic circle. A portal appeared behind him, and a tiny fairy came out. The little creature moved quietly into position, ready to strike. Everyone on the battlefield held their breath. "Dang it," Andreas thought. "That dumb shield can even react to Mylene's sneak attack?" Eve watched, impressed. "That kid," she whispered. "He's way too good at fighting for someone his age. And those 2 soul spaces he has, they must be hiding something big." Then the artifact released more of that black mist again. Around the dragon, new shapes started forming in the smoke. Other creatures began showing up. The priest grinned and said, "You little bug! Let me show you what a real fight looks like." The mist turned into knights, and the priest pointed straight at Andreas and the others. "Attack!" he ordered. Andreas didn't waste time. He opened his subdimensional spaces again and called out his summons, Timur, Rudo, and Nikol. He gave them quick orders to handle the new enemies. Rudo jumped in and swung his sword, slicing one of the knights clean in half. It instantly melted back into mist. Nikol did the same with his blade. Timer, on the other hand, didn't bother with a weapon. He ran forward and landed a powerful punch straight into one of the mist knights. Eve looked over at Andreas and asked, "Shall we go? I'll clear the mist." Andreas nodded and said, "I'll leave that to you." Then he sprinted toward the priest. The priest stepped back, clearly scared, and pointed his staff forward like a warning. "Stay back!" he shouted. The dragon now looked even scarier with all the dark smoke around it. Its eyes glowed with a deep golden light. Eve, standing with Luna's body, stretched out her hands. A wave of green energy rushed out from her, pushing the mist away and creating a clear path for Andreas to run through. The priest's eyes went wide in fear as Andreas got closer. Andreas raised his sword and swung, but once again the shield appeared right in front of the priest, blocking the attack. The priest let out a breath and gave a small smirk. "Told you! It's useless." But Andreas wasn't buying it. He noticed something wasn't right. The priest might have been talking tough, but his face was full of panic. "You're shaking," Andreas said. "Is it because your attacks can't hurt my undead? Or is it the knights? They're the souls of the fire dragon expedition, right? The ones you got killed?" The priest froze in place. "How do you know that?" he asked. Andreas looked him in the eye and said, "Because you didn't just let them die. You kept them trapped and made them suffer even after death." The priest's face twisted. He couldn't handle the truth and shouted, "Shut up!" Andreas kept going, his voice calm but firm. "They're still here, aren't they? You didn't let them rest. They never got the peace of death, did they?" But he had missed something. When he finally looked up at the sky, it might have already been too late. Countless glowing, cross-shaped swords were falling from above. Evan had summoned them. A bright light ripped open a portal, and the blades shot down, hitting the red dragon hard and making it roar in pain. Andreas had to leap back quickly, throwing his arms up to block his face from the light and force. The priest looked terrified, but somehow his shield managed to block a few of the swords. "How?" the priest stammered. The dragon, hurt by the attack, fell to the ground. Even with its tough skin, it couldn't take the hit. Evan's power had brought it down. Andreas gritted his teeth. He was mad that Evan had taken the chance he was waiting for, and even more mad that the attack had almost hit him too. Meanwhile, the priest, shaking with fear, whispered, "You weren't burned by the flames." Evan walked out from the fire, his face serious, eyes sharp. He said, "Binding the dead is just the selfish wish of those who go against nature. I'll bring the wrath of the gods for your foolishness." The priest growled back, eyes full of hate and fear. He was sweating. "As expected, you're my biggest problem." The red dragon, not fully down, spread its wings wide. Its size and power still looked terrifying. Andreas watched Evan closely, wondering if this was some kind of secret aura move. If it was, it looked amazing. But Evan stayed calm, as always. "You don't even see that your biggest obstacle is you," he said. The priest lost it. "Shut up. I'm the one protecting this city. Death is too easy for you. I'll lock you in a prison made of souls and fire. You'll suffer forever." The battle kept getting worse. Flames ate away at the city buildings, making the whole scene even hotter and scarier. Andreas watched the chaos and thought, "That old guy, is he trying to burn down the whole city? Just how much mana does that dragon have?" While he focused on all that, he didn't notice Evan was getting ready for another attack, one that was going to land right in the middle, right where he was standing. By the time Andreas looked forward, it was already too late. The attack was coming straight at him. He jumped into the air, barely dodging it. The blast hit the priest's shield, but again, it didn't do much damage. Still, Andreas was annoyed. "He's doing this on purpose," Andreas thought, glaring at Evan. Then, Andreas looked ahead and asked out loud, "Do you have bad aim or something?" Evan answered calmly, "You move pretty fast, so I gave you a chance. But it seems your brain can't keep up with your body." That made Andreas more alert. He wasn't sure what Evan meant by that. He tried to think back to Evan's last move and what it was meant to do. "Wait, that wasn't to mess with me. That was to make an opening for me to attack?" Evan cut in, saying, "Well, since you're clearly not following, I'll just do it myself." Andreas gave a crooked grin. "If that's what you were planning, you could have just said so from the start." While the two kept going back and forth, Eve, still inside Luna's body, suddenly shouted, "Watch out! It's coming again!" The jet of fire destroyed everything in its way, but as Evan ran, dodging the heat, he couldn't help but wonder, Why was the dragon using such a simple attack over and over again? While he was busy thinking and watching the dragon's movements, he didn't notice its tail swinging toward him. Boom! The tail smacked him hard, sending him rolling across the battlefield. "This is bad," Andreas muttered, watching the dragon shift its body again. Eve, standing next to him, shouted, "With that hit, Evan won't be able to counter. Even if it's just us two, we'll have to go big." Andreas nodded. "If this move doesn't work, I'll come up with something else." Eve looked at him, confused. She couldn't tell what was going on in his head. But then something unexpected happened. A system notification appeared in front of Andreas. The legendary Phantom of Sloth will now execute its intent. Blue light started to glow around him. Energy shimmered and swirled as Andreas raised his sword, standing tall in front of the massive dragon. His sudden power-up caught the priest's attention, who froze, eyes wide. The priest tried to strike first, but it didn't work. "What? How dare you?" the priest yelled, frustrated. The dragon looked ready to fire another giant blast. Andreas could feel the tension rise in his chest. "Retreat! If we can just get rid of that old man," he thought. Then Andreas jumped high into the air, raising his sword above the priest, aiming to make a big impact. But the priest just laughed and shouted again and again how useless it all was. Eve, not giving up, began powering up too. She raised her hands, energy glowing bright as she reached toward the sky. Her goal was to stop the black mist from getting close. "That brat again," the priest yelled, clearly annoyed. But just then, something went wrong. Eve's eyes widened. She turned to the side, thinking, "Dang it, I dropped my guard." In the next moment, the black mist rushed in and swallowed her whole. Andreas shouted her name, but he couldn't do anything to help right now. Suddenly, a voice rang out through the air. "Secret aura technique." A golden sword began to fall from the sky, glowing with blinding light. It looked like it could split the whole world in half. That was the execution of light. Andreas couldn't take his eyes off it. That move. Wasn't that one of Evan's secret aura techniques? He thought. He remembered what Evan had said earlier about how Andreas's mind couldn't keep up with his movements. Now, seeing the golden sword fall like judgment from the sky, he understood. This time, I won't dodge. I'll follow the path Evan opened. Andreas planted his feet firmly on the ground. He saw that the dragon's core was starting to crack. It was finally taking real damage. He gripped his sword tighter, his eyes filled with pure focus, and then, with all his strength, he shouted, "The selfless sword!" Andreas struck straight at the dragon's neck while still fighting. At the same time, Eve was struggling to survive inside the thick mist. She stayed alive by using a defensive move, but now she couldn't escape anymore. She didn't know what else she could do. The strike Andreas made actually seemed to hurt the dragon. When Eve saw the dragon in pain, she thought, "We did it." The dragon's body started breaking into glowing pieces. The priest who had been riding it fell to the ground after the dragon went down. Lying on the floor, the priest mumbled and stuttered, It can't be. The dimensional portal is—" But before he could finish his sentence, his head suddenly flew off. Andreas just stood there, watching the head roll away. Evan, feeling proud of the final blow, looked at the scene and said, "It seems you're no longer needed. It's over. Let's escape." Andreas agreed they had finally won, but said he was going to stay with Luna. He told Evan to go ahead without him. Evan didn't speak right away. He remembered how they used to be enemies and the promise they made, but in the end he just said one word, understood, and then walked away. Andreas moved toward Luna, who was still stuck in the black mist. He thought to himself that even though the old man was gone, the strange smoke was still here. He asked Luna if she was okay and said they had to leave right now. But Luna gave a soft smile and said, "Partner, Luna cannot come." That caught Andreas off guard. He didn't get what she meant. Was she trapped? He quickly said he would use light magic to get rid of the smoke. But as he stepped closer, panic appeared on Luna's face. The smoke grew thicker around her. She said it was no use. The shield was already at its limit, and told him to just go. Andreas yelled, "Don't say something like that." A bright light burst through the area. Andreas didn't care how dangerous it was. He had to save her. He reached out his hand, and Luna looked at him surprised. Tears ran down her face as she wondered if this might actually work. Andreas held back his light power and shouted, "Quick, take my hand. If you stay trapped here, you won't even be able to die. You'll just wander forever." Luna reached out to grab his hand while still holding the shield, but her energy started fading. At that moment, she said quietly, "It's okay, partner." She smiled while crying and tried to make him feel better. "I'm used to things like this." Then, a black sphere formed around her and blasted Andreas away. He hit the ground and rolled. His clothes burned. He sat up and stared at the huge black sphere, his face full of shock. He couldn't speak. Outside the dungeon, a big flash of light lit up the sky. Evan was already out, looking back and trying to understand what just happened. He squinted and thought, "So once you leave, you can't go back? That was dumb. We should have left together." But something felt wrong. Why hadn't they come out yet? That question kept bouncing around in his head. Back inside, Andreas was on his knees in front of the dark sphere that had taken Luna. His head hung low, his heart full of anger and pain. He said quietly, "This can't be happening. I will definitely get out with Luna." Just then he felt a sharp pain and heard a voice he knew. "You're really greedy." He swallowed hard as pain rose in his chest, but what surprised him the most wasn't the pain. It was the thought that popped into his mind. Original sin. Then that same familiar voice spoke again. "Oh, so you noticed. It seems you're not completely useless." Andreas already felt uncomfortable. That voice always annoyed him, but the voice kept going. "You want to save so many things even though you're weak." Andreas let out a small laugh at that. He answered, "Coming from someone who would also be wandering forever if I stayed trapped here, that's pretty funny." Greed, however, explained that it wasn't even complaining about that. That part shocked Andreas a little. Then suddenly the crown lifted off his body and floated into his hand. Andreas stared at it, confused and surprised. He asked if it was really him. The artifact answered that yes, it was, and said the crown would be perfect for someone as greedy as him. So Andreas placed the crown on his head. At that exact moment, the system message echoed in his mind. "You have become the true master of the crown of greed. The transcendental emotional state of greed has been surpassed. Mana absorption, mana resistance, mana control, and physical regeneration were all at 666%. The perception genius talent acquired temporarily. Physical strength temporarily immutable. The transcendental emotional state of greed acquired. You've become the master of the crown for 66 seconds. Andreas held a ball of glowing light energy and thought to himself, "Perception genius. The magic I could barely control before now works perfectly." He grinned. "With this, I can save Luna." He poured his power into the black sphere. Right away, a huge blast of light exploded from it. At the same time, deep inside that endless darkness, Luna stood alone. The only thing she could still see was her own hand. She thought, "He has people waiting for him outside, so it's okay." Luna tried hard not to cry. She remembered all the great moments she'd had with Andreas over the past few days. She remembered the bond they built in such a short time, the missions, the laughs, the adventures. It was all so special, but now she was all alone in the dark. She wiped her tears and said softly, "But Luna had so much fun." Just then, a strong light filled the darkness. Luna had to shield her eyes, which had gotten used to the dark. She started to see sparks of power and light dancing in front of her, and then she heard a familiar voice. "Who do you think I am? I wouldn't leave you behind." Andreas stood right there, stronger than ever. He reached out a hand to her, smiling warmly like he always did. Luna had been trying not to cry, but now she couldn't hold it anymore. Tears fell down her face as she said, "But if we were trapped here." Andreas cut her off with something he had told her long before any of this happened. "We're friends." That one line echoed in her heart. She held onto it with all her strength. She couldn't take it anymore and ran to hug him tight, full of emotion, happy to have her partner back. Somewhere deep inside, Greed gave a twisted little smile and muttered, "Here it comes." Out of nowhere, that soft moment between them changed into something strange. Andreas suddenly felt a heavy, unbearable pressure all over his body. Luna, still in his arms, fainted right away. Blood started pouring from Andreas's mouth and nose, and Luna's eyes widened in shock. Even as his body shook, Andreas didn't look away. His eyes were wide open as he thought, "What is coming?" Then Greed's voice spoke with a teasing tone. "You know who it is. It's Lethe." Andreas fell to the ground just as a massive and strange figure appeared before him. It was made of light and fire. He looked up and thought, "What is this pressure? I don't know if it's really a god or not, but it's definitely dangerous." The glowing figure stared down at him with glowing red eyes and spoke. "Why did you summon me, observer?" Andreas couldn't handle the pressure. As he lowered his head, his whole body suddenly exploded in blood. That blood started to mix with the dark shadow of Greed. Greed began to speak like it was no big deal. "Oh, it's nothing special." Andreas tried to turn his head to see where Greed was. At the same time, he could feel Greed's emotions moving through his body. Revenge. And a crazy, strong wish to kill. Greed kept talking. "I'm here to warn you. Go ahead and write your will, because I'm going to kill all of you." He said it with a smile that didn't fade at all. Lethe replied calmly, "I understand. I'm looking forward to it." Greed just laughed like a maniac. "That's it. Now get lost." Andreas, struggling to stay conscious in the middle of that insane pressure, thought, "These bastards. They're talking like I'm not even here." Right then, Lethe's voice echoed again. "To think you could hear our whole conversation and still stay sane. Impressive. I'll give you a farewell gift before I go." Andreas's eyes widened. He couldn't believe what he just heard. "I pray that you and the observer get what you desire," Lethe added. Andreas used every last bit of strength and shouted. A system message appeared right after. "A blessing has been granted by those beyond memory. The blessing will activate automatically when the right conditions are met." Slowly, Andreas wiped the blood from his mouth and started to laugh. He thought, "What kind of blessing is this supposed to be?" He was still shocked. Was that really a god? Then he looked down at Luna, still passed out in his lap. He gently touched her to make sure she was still alive. After checking and seeing that she was safe, he turned around. There it was, the dragon's body. It was still lying there. Andreas knew what he had to do next. He had to awaken it. Meanwhile, outside the dungeon, Evan was waiting. He was getting more worried by the minute. He thought, "What I just saw, that amount of mana, that's insane." Andreas stayed focused, gathering all the energy he could. He thought that if it wasn't for the power of the crown boosting his mana, none of this would be possible. Right then, the system gave an update. The dragon's heart is still being summoned. Energy floated wildly around Andreas. It wasn't stable. He looked around and thought, the dragon's heart is still here, but how much energy does it need to bring it out completely? The system gave another notice. Intermediate necromancy. Skeleton summoning successful. A bone dragon, mythical, has been summoned. Before him stood the skeleton of a massive red dragon. Its head, now made of bone, stared right at Andreas. The system added, "The summoned corpse is at a high level. A status bonus has been given. This is the final form of the summoned creature." Andreas felt proud. It had worked. The dragon's huge skeleton started moving. Its deep eye sockets glowed with a soft red light. Its mouth opened, showing a row of sharp bone teeth. The system spoke again. "This undead is at mythical level. Some traits from its past life have been saved." That's when the dragon spoke. "To think I was finally going to rest forever. What a cruel fate." Andreas froze in shock. "You can speak." The dragon seemed to understand Andreas's reaction. Andreas said, "I didn't expect you to keep this much of your ego." The dragon replied, "It's not perfect. Only a piece of my heart remains." Andreas kept watching, surprised by how much the dragon was talking. The system opened a new status window. Bone Dragon, Mythical, Krav Maga Undead, Level 12, Mana, 245,111 traits. Ego, Shattered Dragon Heart, Dragon Tongue, Decomposition, Wisdom, Physical Resistance. Note, his ego is fully held together by a powerful force. Krava looked at him and asked, "Do you know what this crown is?" Andreas took a deep breath, stood firm and answered, "Don't call me you. Call me Master." Krava paused for a second, confused. "Master, huh? In that case, I'll become your servant, if you give me the crown." Andreas couldn't believe what he just heard, but Krav Maga went on. I already belong to you, so giving me the crown is no different than just letting me borrow it. Andreas stared with a serious face. He thought, I still need greed just in case summoning gets harder later. But for now, I'll accept this deal. He smiled and said yes, but he had one condition. If you don't agree to it, I'll make sure you learn who your master is, even if I have to teach you the hard way. 3 days later, Andreas and Luna were in the kingdom of Grandis. Andreas let out a laugh and said, It feels like I've gone back a few years. Luna smiled and replied, Hasn't it been that long? Andreas nodded and said, Maybe, but it feels like only 10 days really passed. He thought, Good. It doesn't look like there are any side effects. A lot had happened during those days, but Andreas was finally relaxed. They had fixed everything, and he was just happy they got to enjoy a short holiday. As they walked through the busy city streets, Andreas couldn't help but think about the war waiting for them up north. Once they returned to the Empire, there would be no time to rest. They'd have to start preparing right away. While he was deep in thought, Luna pointed at a nearby merchant's stall. Her eyes lit up with excitement. She really wanted to try the snacks being sold there. They looked crispy and tasty, all lined up in neat little rows. Andreas stood beside her, watching as she happily took bite after bite. All I'm asking is that you eat slowly, he said with a tired but gentle voice. Luna just smiled and kept enjoying the food. Later, at the train station, Luna turned to him and said, I want to go with you. But Andreas shook his head. No way. If we go back to the Empire together, there's going to be a lot of trouble. Luna gave a small pout and tried to act cute. I'm so lonely. But Andreas stayed firm. I'm sure we'll meet again soon. She sighed, then reached into her pocket and placed something in his hand. Take this with you, she said softly. He opened his hand and saw a small box. With a warm smile, she waved. Goodbye. Take care. I'll contact you again. Andreas gave a short bow and smiled again, quietly hoping she would also stay safe. The train's loud whistle echoed across the trees and hills. From the speakers, the announcer said, We will soon arrive at Rodlin Academy. Please prepare to disembark. Andreas sat in his seat, lost in thought. He was glad to finally be back in his homeland. He knew tomorrow would be busy, so he figured he'd try to rest while he still could. But just as he leaned back and closed his eyes, someone walked past his seat. A man dropped an envelope onto Andreas's lap and called his name, but the man didn't stop or say anything else. He just kept walking. Andreas looked down at the envelope and picked it up. A letter, sealed with black magic, he thought. This is a secret message. He turned to look at the man, but nothing about him looked familiar. The train slowed down as the station neared. Andreas stood up, still thinking about the mystery. The members of the congregation are hiding everywhere. That makes things easy, but it's still creepy to have all his moves watched. For now, I'll follow the meeting rules. As soon as he stepped off the train, he spotted someone, a young girl with green hair. It was someone he had thought about a few times during his last adventure. She looked a little unsure, but when she heard his voice say, We were on the same train, weren't we, Vivian? She turned toward him. The wind gently moved his green hair, and his smile was small but real. Vivian was surprised to see him too. In her mind, she pictured herself running toward him, dropping her luggage and hugging him tightly. All the lonely feelings would disappear in that one warm moment. But that was just in her imagination. In real life, she only said in a quiet voice, Andreas, you've been well? He nodded. Yeah, I have. What about you and your family? Vivian stayed quiet for a moment. Then she smiled softly. A memory came to her. Her house had always been filled with the sound of swords clashing. Outside, a man trained hard with his blade, practicing non-stop. Vivian would stand in front of him, holding her own sword, refusing to back down. Their attacks were so fast, it was hard to even see them. The rhythm of the battle was so sharp and fast, it felt like the air itself was cutting. In the end, Vivian managed to knock the sword out of the man's hands. It flew through the air, and only after it clattered to the ground behind her did she finally relax. The man stared at his hands, totally quiet. Then finally said he couldn't believe what just happened. Vivian looked proud and told him that it was amazing because she had met a great master. He looked at her and asked if she wanted to become a knight for the Cromwell family. Without thinking twice, Vivian said yes. She couldn't imagine doing anything else. The man gave a serious nod and said she had turned into a true knight. He explained that a real knight chooses their own master before anyone can call them one, and he would honor her choice. Vivian was a bit shocked by what he said. She closed her eyes tight for a second, then gave a deep bow to show her thanks. Later, when she met Andreas again, he asked her how things had gone. She simply told him a big thing had happened. Andreas looked confused and asked what she meant. But before he could say anything else, Vivian grabbed her suitcase, turned with a little smile and said it was a secret. She'd tell him later. After all, she said, what girl doesn't have a few secrets? She walked off, while Andreas just stood there, frozen and silent. As they walked through their hometown, the streets were packed with people. The noise never stopped. Someone nearby said it looked like food stalls were popping up for the Academy's opening day tomorrow. Andreas, walking beside Vivian, said the crowd was too much and asked if she wanted to go somewhere quieter. Vivian liked the idea of being alone with him and agreed, but before they could go anywhere, they ran into Diane and Lucia. Lucia spotted Andreas right away and yelled, "Senior seaweed!" Vivian sighed quietly, already missing the calm moment she thought they would have. When Lucia came running up, she asked why he didn't message her when he came back. Andreas didn't get a chance to answer and instead asked how she was doing. Lucia said she was great and had been enjoying life all thanks to him. Diane showed up next and told Lucia not to interrupt since it looked like they had just walked into a special moment. Lucia was surprised, but Andreas quickly explained they had just bumped into each other by accident. Lucia gave a playful grin and repeated his words in a teasing tone, acting like she didn't fully believe him. Vivian felt super awkward and couldn't even look at Andreas. She didn't know how to deal with her feelings. Andreas tried to calm things down, saying Lucia should stop messing around because Vivian was getting embarrassed. His usual clueless mode was kicking in full power. Lucia thought the same thing. How could this guy be so blind? He kept going, saying Lucia always went too far with her jokes. But Vivian wasn't flustered because of the teasing. What really got her was the fact that she had tricked herself into thinking it was a date. That's why she wanted a quiet place. That thought alone made her blush. Even with all the craziness, Andreas was feeling happy. Lucia seemed like she had healed completely. He looked at his group of friends and thought that even DNA seemed to be becoming more like her best self. DNA caught him staring, turned a little red, and asked with a sly smile, "So, you two?" That's when an awkward silence filled the air. Andreas, not even noticing, had let his eyes drift straight to DNA's neckline. He froze, not sure if she saw him staring. DNA didn't say anything at first, but checked her clothes, thinking something might be wrong. Lucia noticed too. Totally embarrassed, DNA pulled her cloak up and asked, "What are you looking at?" Lucia's eyes widened, shocked, while Andreas started sweating and panicking, unsure how to explain himself. He quickly began to apologize, calling her name nervously. DNA stepped back, clearly flustered, while Vivian stayed stuck in her own thoughts, still thinking about the strange moment earlier. Lucia tried to step in and calm the chaos. "Senior, please understand the situation," she said, but Andreas waved his hands and blurted, "I already told you that's not what it was." And just like that, the whole thing turned into a random funny mess. A sudden comedy scene with Andreas and all the girls. Somehow, they were all starting to grow as people. Even through stuff like this. Later on, in the personal research building at Rodlin Academy, Andreas sat alone, thinking. He started wondering about all the other playable characters who were now under his care. Maybe he'd go watch the first-year fencing class later. He pulled a letter from his pocket, the one he got back on the train. It had come to him without a name or sender. As he opened it, he read the words written inside. "Contributor of the Sloth, the rising star in the world of dark magic, Andreas Cromwell, I'm inviting you to the next meeting." He blinked. A meeting invitation? That was perfect. After getting the soul seal from Lord Orc and taking control of Krav Maga body, his strength had jumped up fast. But now he needed information. What he really wanted was a way to track future events, especially ones that didn't follow the game's original story. He thought to himself, I need to know in advance what moves the Emperor might make. That part could be handled quietly using the Morhaime family. That's when Luna came to mind. He considered using her for that. But in his head, he imagined Luna cheerfully spilling the secret to Jester without knowing. Andreas shook the image out of his head. Nope. That wouldn't work. He dropped the letter into a flame and watched it burn, telling himself, "No, if that's the case, I can't let anyone mess with my plans. I'll slowly spread my influence inside the meeting myself." As the paper turned to ash, all proof linking him to the group vanished in the fire. His mind was set. He would take control of that next meeting no matter what. Meanwhile, far away in a place that wasn't even marked on the map, Evan walked through the forest, completely silent. Suddenly, he heard footsteps. Several people in white robes and hoods came out, swords raised. He was surrounded. These weren't regular people. They were 3 powerful masters. Their leader, an older man, walked out from the deep shadows of the forest and spoke. He said, "This level of capture was needed for what's coming. Now answer me. Why did you go against the will of God, Evan von Orlean?" Evan, wearing a dark mage outfit, stepped forward and removed his hood. He showed his face and said calmly, "I already wrote this in my report. I reached enlightenment." But before Evan could say more, the man cut him off. He asked if Evan had been corrupted by dark magic. He said it didn't make sense for someone like Evan, a symbol of the holy nation, to write such a report. Evan noticed the hooded soldiers quietly shifting their positions, ready to attack if needed. He calmly said they should think of it as just a different way of seeing things. The man pressed his hands together and said that if it really was just a difference in how God's will was understood, then Evan would have to prove it, with blood. That's when Evan remembered the image of Andreas, who had told him that compared to him, chasing a child in a desperate attempt to kill her is worse than a lying dark mage. He slowly pulled out his sword, thinking to himself that what was happening now, this wasn't God's will. Right then, the soldiers all moved forward, seeing Evan as a threat. But before they could get any closer, a voice spoke out casually. Are you guys busy?" the voice said. Everyone stopped and turned, surprised by the sudden interruption. The elder squinted and asked, "Why are you here?" The man who spoke was Maximin Cronell, a blond guy who looked like he was in his 40s. Calm and confident, he said he had heard Evan met God. The white paladin didn't say a word. His face stayed serious and quiet. The elder stepped between them, trying to block Maximin's path. He said this had nothing to do with him, no matter who he was or where he came from, even if it was the holy nation. But Maximin wasn't interested in backing off. He looked straight at the old man and said, "Hey, old man, if you don't leave right now with all your people, by tomorrow this holy nation of yours will be nothing but ruins." The words hit hard. Fear and panic started to creep into the elder's face. Time passed. The sky stayed full of stars, and the sound of a campfire crackling filled the silence. Maximin and Evan now sat side by side near the fire. Maximin looked over and asked about something that had been bugging him. "That ball of light. Were you talking to an ancient god?" Evan nodded. He was thinking back to what he saw in that dungeon with Andreas. When he confirmed it, Maximin stood up. He picked up a long object wrapped in cloth, something like a sword or maybe even a coffin. Then he asked, "Where is he now?" Evan looked at him and said he planned to find him himself. But Maximin didn't back down. He said, "I don't want to hurt him. Just tell me his name. I think he might have the answer I've been looking for." Inside a huge, beautiful castle, many people were sitting around a long table. One of them suddenly looked shocked and asked if it was really true that someone had conquered Modra's tower. A woman nodded and said yes. She explained that the unbreakable record set by Maximin had finally been beaten. She also told them that the flower in front of them was made by the same person using magic. At first, the others looked at the flower and said it just looked normal, but even though it seemed simple, it had a special formula behind it. They decided to take a closer look. One man reached out and touched the flower, and right then the entire room changed into a field full of flowers. Everyone was amazed. Well, almost everyone. One guy didn't really find it that cool. He said it was just a flower field, but someone else quickly corrected him, saying it wasn't just about flowers. The magic included time, rotation, and even reversal. They explained that the person who made this used contradictions in a way no one would expect from a student. What made it even more impressive was that it was all done using a double magic circle. For a student, actually even for someone who wasn't, it was a crazy good invention. One of them said this person could be a hidden gem, someone who might even become a powerful warlock one day. He didn't just conquer Modra's tower, he also created a magic circle that surprised everyone. With talent like that, it might be smart to bring him to Port Lion. After hearing all of this, the woman agreed and said they should send a messenger to him right away. But before she could continue, the door suddenly burst open and someone ran in yelling that there was a problem. He said Maximin Kronel had started moving. Everyone in the room went silent. They looked shocked. One person asked why that monster was moving. Another said Maximin had never shown any signs of doing anything until now. Someone else said this was a big problem since Maximin had a wild temper and there weren't many people who could stop him if he got serious. The woman then asked if this was the same man who became Rodland's most wanted after that incident in the past. Another man asked if they knew what Maximin's goal was, and the guy who brought the news said they weren't sure yet. But he added that based on the latest report, Maximin had already crossed Rodland's border. Hearing that shocked everyone even more. Of all places, he had gone to Rodland. This could turn into something serious real fast. Meanwhile, back at the academy, Luis went to go see Andreas. When he got there, he saw something crazy. Andreas and Selena were fighting, their blades clashing hard. Luis was surprised. He never thought Selena could fight that well against Andreas. But it didn't take long for him to realize that Andreas wasn't even trying. He turned his head toward Chris and asked what was wrong, telling him to come join the fight too. Chris replied that things weren't the same anymore. They had grown stronger since the entrance ceremony, and maybe Andreas was underestimating them too much. Andreas smirked and told him to just say so if he didn't have the confidence. Chris didn't like that. He said Andreas would regret those words, then dashed forward and swung his blade at him. But in the blink of an eye, Andreas vanished from where he stood. He reappeared above Chris and said, "You're all bark and no bite." Watching the fight, Luis realized something. Both Chris and Selena had really improved. Andreas felt the same thing Luis did. Chris and Selena were doing a good job dodging his attacks and even trying to hit back with counter moves. But even with that, Andreas was still blocking and dodging everything without much effort. His speed was clearly on another level, and he was kind of blitzing them. Luis kept watching and noticed something important. He recognized the type of aura Chris was using. That surprised him. Chris was actually going all out, even though this was just a sparring match. And not just Chris. Selena also dashed in to strike Andreas, but again, he blocked both of them with ease. Then, with a grin on his face, Andreas suddenly activated his magic. A second later, he sent both of them flying backward. Luis's eyes widened in shock. He couldn't believe Andreas had used magic during the spar. Chris, still lying on the ground, shouted that it wasn't fair to use magic. But Andreas just looked at him and asked if he'd say the same thing on an actual battlefield. He told him it was a good idea to get used to fighting enemies who use magic, so this was just good practice. Chris argued that this wasn't a battlefield, but Andreas moved on. He told them both they had gotten stronger. He looked at Chris and said his technique had become sharper, fast enough to match the speed of his own Unir-style swordsmanship. Then he turned to Selena and told her she was finally able to swing her sword the way she wanted now that she had one that fit her properly. As the training match wrapped up, Luis decided it was time to call out to Andreas. But just as he opened his mouth, someone else beat him to it. Lucia's voice rang out loudly as she shouted Andreas's name. She walked up to him and asked what he was doing here, reminding him that he promised they were going to try a new potion together today. Hearing that, Andreas turned to Luis and said sorry. It looked like he couldn't spar with him today after all. He told Luis they'd definitely spar next time and that he was looking forward to it. Luis smiled and said that was fine. Andreas and Lucia walked together through the school hallways. Lucia said happily that it was finally a new term. She asked him if he had any goals for this term, but before he could answer, she cut in with her own answer. She cheerfully said her goal was to learn a bunch of new magic. Since she got a second chance at life thanks to Andreas, she didn't want to waste even a second of it. More than anything, she wanted to enjoy her school life more. There were so many fun things she missed out on when she was sick, and now she wanted to see and experience all of them. After yapping for a while, she finally asked him again what his goal was. Inwardly, Andreas had planned to attend the congregation's meeting and that he was just waiting for the day to come. According to the info he got from Morheims, there was still time before a war sparked by resentment in the north would break out. He replied to Lucia by just telling her that he thought he'd spend some time doing magic research. Lucia asked Andreas what kind of research he meant, and he told her he wanted to try using techniques that mix different magic types with swordsmanship. On the inside, though, he was thinking something else. There were plenty of times when he couldn't use undead magic, so it wouldn't hurt to be ready for other situations. After hearing his answer, Lucia smiled and said that meant he was now her rival. She explained that she also planned to focus on learning combat magic. Andreas gave her a confused look and asked what she meant by rival. She told him the only reason he was getting so much attention was because she had been too sick before to show off her real skills. Now that she was healthy, things were going to be different. Andreas gave her a look that clearly said, "Yeah, sure," and she noticed it. But before she could say anything else, his expression suddenly changed. He looked out the window and became serious. That's when it happened. A huge explosion rocked the building across from them, and fire burst out from it. Both of them froze for a second, trying to figure out what was going on. Andreas quickly realized the explosion came from the academy's main gate. Without wasting a moment, he told Lucia to run toward the rear gate opposite from the explosion. She looked confused and asked what he was going to do. But he didn't answer. He just turned and ran straight toward the explosion, thinking something wasn't right. There weren't supposed to be any attacks on the academy during this time of year. So what was going on? Could this be something the congregation had planned? But when Andreas arrived at the scene, what he saw shocked him. Some of the strongest people in the entire academy were lying on the ground, unconscious. Even Principal Zeos and Ivy had been taken down. Andreas rushed over to check if they were okay, but before he could do anything, a voice suddenly called out his name. He turned around fast, and his heart dropped. Standing there was Maximin Kronel. Maximin looked straight at him and pointed out the obvious. Andreas was wearing a robe from the magic faculty and had a sword at his side. Maximin gave a small smile and said it looked like the man he'd been searching for had shown himself. Maximin stood in front of Andreas with a relaxed, almost careless look, making Andreas wonder why he had come. So Andreas asked him directly, and Maximin replied that he was here for him. But before anything else, he wanted to see if Andreas was the real deal. Without warning, he launched forward, vanishing from sight for a moment before appearing behind Andreas with a sudden strike. Andreas barely managed to dodge the powerful blow, retreating a few steps away before asking what Maximin thought he was doing. Maximin didn't answer with words at first. Instead, he gripped his blade tightly. At that moment, Andreas felt a sharp sense of danger rise inside him. He instantly summoned an earth shield, but Maximin's strike tore through it with ease, slicing it in half. The shield shattered, leaving Andreas shocked, staring at Maximin, who calmly told him to show the power of God that was inside him. At the same time, throughout the academy, a voice echoed across the halls, instructing all students to leave immediately through the rear gates and to follow the assistant professors waiting outside. Lucia, upon hearing this, thought about Andreas and wondered if he was safe. Back in the middle of the fight, Andreas was coughing and breathing hard. He asked Maximin what he meant by "show him the power of God," but Maximin only rushed in again, saying they would talk later. Andreas raised his weapon to block, but the impact still sent him flying backward, crashing into the walls. Pain surged through his body, and he cursed to himself, annoyed that even though he blocked, the hit landed hard. He quickly realized Maximin was after one thing, but he couldn't understand why it had to be from him. Maximin then said that, just like Evan had claimed, Andreas only started to use his powers when he was pushed to the brink of death. Thinking of Evan made Andreas clench his teeth, furious inside as he called Evan a rat bastard. Maximin pressed on, declaring that he would help Andreas reach that point. He increased the force of his attacks, his movements so quick that Andreas could barely follow them. To anyone else, Maximin might have looked like he was swinging his sword randomly, but every strike landed with deadly precision. Knowing he couldn't win at this rate, Andreas muttered that he would rather summon Nickel for help than die here. But before he could act, the original sin living inside him suddenly appeared, whispering that he should move closer to Maximin instead. While blocking strike after strike, Andreas shouted back in frustration, asking what it meant, pointing out he already had his hands full, just defending himself. The original sin pressed further, asking what he was so afraid of, and reminded him about the gift he had received from Lethe. That reminder sparked a memory. Andreas recalled when the system had told him he'd been blessed by the ones beyond remembrance, and that the blessing would automatically manifest once the right conditions were met. Inwardly, he thought that if the condition was his life itself, then he would gladly give it up. At that moment, Andreas's eyes turned blood red as he prepared to clash once more with Maximin. But before he could strike, he sensed a strange aura seeping out from the coffin strapped to Maximin's back. A system notification appeared before him. Blessing of the One Beyond Remembrance has detected traces of another god. Conditions are now fulfilled. Immediately his arm began to glow, followed by another notification. Blessing, seed of the god killer has been activated. Maximin, taken aback, narrowed his eyes and asked if Andreas was giving up. But then yet another notification appeared for Andreas, stating that the blessing was temporarily suppressing the presence of the one known as God. Andreas then looked at Maximin and asked if the reason he had come searching for him was because of the coffin on his back, saying he could feel something strange coming from it. Maximin slowly sheathed his sword and replied by asking if Andreas could awaken the person within the coffin. Andreas answered bluntly that he saw no reason to do such a thing, especially not for a man who had just tried to kill him. Besides, he added, the guards would arrive soon, and he had no reason to help, nor was he in any position to do so. Maximin simply remarked that Andreas wasn't denying that he had the ability to do it, but Andreas told him firmly to leave, insisting that he needed to take care of the wounded. Suddenly, Maximin shifted his tone. He asked Andreas what he truly wanted, promising he would grant him anything as long as he awakened the one inside the coffin. Hearing the most powerful and most insane man in the world humble himself like this made Andreas grin. He told Maximin that he wasn't interested in hearing promises from a man he didn't even know. Maximin then gave him his name, finally introducing himself, and declared that he would be waiting in the golden maple forest. With that, he disappeared into the air. Left alone, Andreas muttered that he didn't really have a choice. After all, the coffin seemed to be the one thing that Maximin's life revolved around. Later that night, Andreas went to the golden maple forest. There he found Maximin seated quietly, waiting. When Andreas approached, he stated his terms before touching the coffin. He said that if he awakened the one inside, then whenever he needed help, no matter the situation or the enemy, Maximin would have to come to his aid 3 times. That was his condition. Maximin agreed without a hint of hesitation. With a small nod, Andreas said, "All right," and began. He opened the coffin, revealing a young woman lying gracefully on a bed of flowers. At that moment, Andreas's hand began to glow again, as the system announced, "Seed of the god killer has detected the presence of the ones that fall from death." A realization struck him. The seed of the god killer only reacted when it came into contact with beings holding transcendental power. And the searing pain he had suffered earlier when his arm first glowed was gone now. Bringing his glowing hand closer to the girl, he thought to himself that if he could suppress this god's power, then maybe. But his thoughts were cut short by Maximin's voice. Maximin told him that this girl meant everything to him, and he should treat her with care. The warning was clear. If Andreas failed, Maximin would kill him without hesitation. In truth, it was Andreas who seemed more desperate in this moment. The woman's name was Isabel Lucifer, a direct descendant of a race capable of wielding blood magic. Her lineage was deeply tied to one of the deadly sins, lust, the vampire. Andreas couldn't deny that her beauty was overwhelming, an obvious sign of her connection to that sin. No wonder Maximin, the strongest human in the world, was completely enthralled by her. Suddenly, a system notification appeared before Andreas. "Blessing, seed of the god killer has been activated." He froze in shock, confused, because he thought it had already been activated earlier. Then, without warning, enormous spiky plants burst out from the coffin. The sudden eruption startled Maximin and injured Andreas slightly as the sharp vines spread. Within moments, the plants grew into massive, towering structures that overwhelmed the area. Maximin stared at the massive plant that had erupted from the coffin, while Andreas, still on the ground, wondered if the ritual had worked. Maximin then called out Andreas's name, his voice sharp, and glared menacingly at him as he demanded to know what was going on. Andreas instantly felt the crushing aura pouring out from Maximin. At the same time, a system notification appeared before him. "The effect of the ones that fall from death has been lowered. Resistance of the one that falls from death has increased." Reading it quickly, Andreas explained to Maximin that the thorns were the very ones used to pierce the god who had placed Isabel into her long sleep. Before Maximin could respond, their attention was drawn to a soft, delicate voice. Isabel had awakened Dot. She whispered his name, apologizing for making him wait for so long, Tears welled in Maximin's eyes as he saw her awake at last. Meanwhile, inside one of the imperial towers, Evan received word of what Maximin had done at the academy. Irritated, he muttered that of all times, this had to happen while he was away. He called it a nuisance, grumbling that he would rather deal with a war than with Maximin. Turning to the two informants, he asked about casualties and damages. One reported that several people had been injured, including Principal Zeos and Assistant Professor Ivy, but none of their wounds were life-threatening. The second added that, although he had only seen from a distance, he witnessed Maximin speaking with the tower conqueror Andreas, before discreetly leaving toward the park by the main gate. Evan froze at this information, shocked to hear that Andreas and the Empire's most wanted man had spoken directly. Inwardly, he wondered what on earth the two could possibly have been discussing. Regardless, he realized this would become a serious issue if the Emperor ever discovered it. He quickly asked his men if anyone else knew. They both confirmed no one else had seen, since the other faculty were busy evacuating the students. Evan ordered them to keep the matter secret, declaring that he would personally investigate the situation. Back in the forest, another notification appeared for Andreas. Blessing. Seed of the God Killer has obtained 1 trace. Change will occur once all 4 traces are collected. He frowned, thinking to himself whether the seed still had hidden abilities he hadn't uncovered. Isabel then turned to Maximin, saying softly that 40 years had passed in human time. She wrapped her arms around him, apologizing again for making him wait so long. She explained that even in her slumber she had felt his pain as he wandered the land searching for a way to save her. To be sure, Maximin asked if this wasn't some dream. Isabel shook her head gently, assuring him it was real. Andreas stood nearby, watching them quietly. Then Isabel approached him, asking if he had been the one to wake her. He nodded and introduced himself as Andreas Cromwell. Isabel bowed her head slightly and thanked him from the bottom of her heart. Andreas, in turn, told her there was no need to thank him, saying it was only possible because of Maximin's relentless efforts. Maximin himself also thanked Andreas, reminding him that he would honor the deal they made earlier no matter what. Andreas acknowledged him, though inwardly he reflected that while Maximin was indeed the strongest ally he could possibly gain, he was still a criminal, and his usefulness felt no different from relying on an undead. Maximin then asked whether the god who had put Isabel to sleep was dead. Andreas shook his head, explaining that he had only lifted the curse on her. He added that he couldn't say for certain if the effect would be permanent. Maximin asked Andreas if he meant there was a chance Isabel might fall asleep again. Andreas suggested that for the time being they both should stay at his domain on the border of the Empire. He explained that he had used his powers to absorb the curse, but the master of the curse was still a god. Since he wasn't fully certain of the results, he believed it was safer to be cautious in case the curse reawakened. Isabel responded kindly, saying it was generous of him, and asked Maximin why they shouldn't accept such an offer. But Maximin reminded her that he was still the Empire's most wanted man. Isabel countered, asking what he had to worry about when he was already the strongest man alive. Besides, she added, they could always hide their identity out in the frontier. Smiling faintly, she confessed she wanted to experience living a normal life, even if only for a short while. Inwardly, Andreas reflected that while Isabel now seemed like an ordinary woman, she had once been close to becoming a vampire queen. But along the way, she had meddled with the power of the gods and fallen victim to their curse. Keeping someone like her close might help him uncover the whereabouts of the deadly sin of lust. Maximin then turned to him and asked if he would accept their stay. Andreas agreed at once, though inwardly he thought that with these two in his territory, he wouldn't have to worry about his sister Amy's safety for some time. Suddenly Isabel sniffed the air. The scent led her toward Andreas, and she remarked that the smell was nostalgic. She looked at him and said he was that girl's favorite. Andreas blinked in confusion until she clarified, naming Angela Lucifer, her little sister. She assumed Andreas had met her before. At that moment, Andreas was shaken by the revelation. Later, in a snowy province, Andreas found himself inside a quiet bar. The thought of Angela, whom he had nearly forgotten, weighed on his mind. She had been the very first subject he ever evolved, and the one who had once drunk his blood. Now he realized she was Isabel's younger sister. Inwardly, he reasoned that if their relationship was amicable, his chances of getting closer to lust would improve. The real problem, though, was Angela's whereabouts. He decided he could ask Isabel about her later. For now his focus was on the congregation's meeting. Still, he wondered why they had chosen such a remote place, the northern province of Volgien. He hadn't known that even the feudal lord of Volgien was involved with the Black Mages. Not only that, but they had specifically summoned him despite his connection to the deadly sins. As he sat at his table sipping his drink, a man approached and asked if he minded sharing. Without waiting for a reply, the man sat down and commented that drinking before a big event was a bad idea, adding that if it were him, he'd drink afterward. Andreas, irritated, told the man to be quiet while he ate, saying he was embarrassing the congregation. The man grew furious at the remark, but Andreas went on, pointing out that even though they were meeting in the middle of nowhere, it was shocking that a black mage would have such a loose mouth. The man snapped back, calling Andreas a piece of trash who had only gotten lucky, and asked if he thought he was something special. Andreas responded calmly, revealing the man's full identity. He was Brown from Jester's faction. The man froze, confused, and demanded to know how Andreas could possibly know his name and faction. Andreas smirked and asked if that was really such a surprise. He then told Brown to stop wasting time and simply do his job, show him the way. Brown clicked his tongue, calling Andreas a cheeky bastard, and told him to just look forward to the congregation. Inwardly, Andreas thought that if even a mook like Brown had shown up, then it meant a lot of mooks were going to be at the congregation this time. The two men walked side by side through the snowy landscape until they arrived at a castle standing just outside the town. Andreas noted to himself that, despite being in the middle of nowhere, the place didn't look like a lousy venue at all. When they entered, the hall was crowded with dark mages, many of them whispering and conversing with one another. Suddenly, a familiar voice called out to him. Dragon had spotted Andreas and greeted him with, "Long time no see." He smirked and remarked that Andreas wasn't with Salem this time, then asked if he had lost his mind by coming here alone. Andreas replied calmly that he was there because he had been invited. Dragon laughed, saying he didn't recall the congregation ever being so short-handed that they'd invite Andreas to fill Karen's shoes. He then wondered aloud whose idea that could have been. Inwardly, Andreas realized that Dragon must have been keeping an eye on him since the sloth case. Out loud, he told Dragon that the one who had invited him was none other than Master Jester himself. Dragon scoffed, casting a look toward Jester, who had just entered the hall. He muttered that either Jester wasn't reading the room at all, or he was doing it on purpose. Then, with a sharp grin, he welcomed Andreas to the congregation, adding that he looked forward to seeing how things turned out. As Jester made his entrance, everyone in the hall turned their eyes toward Andreas. Murmurs spread quickly among the crowd, voices rising as they recognized him. Some called him the boy who had once threatened the congregation, scoffing at his nerve. Others sneered, saying he had some guts to show his face there, claiming the congregation had fallen to the point of being toyed with by a brat. The air filled with bitter laughter and whispers, with one voice declaring that there was a limit to how foolish one could be. Then the murmuring broke as someone pushed through the crowd, moving people aside. To everyone's surprise, it was Luna. She lit up upon seeing Andreas, her face breaking into a smile. To the shock of the congregation, she went straight to him and asked how he had been. Andreas answered simply that he was doing well, and added that he was glad to see she was doing fine too. Luna responded cheerfully, saying of course she was, because it was the life he had given her after all, so she had to make the best of it. Then she told him to come along with her, promising they had some tasty food nearby. The black mages looked on, stunned. They began murmuring again, noting that Andreas was somehow acquainted with Luna Pendragon. Questions spread quickly. What was the meaning of this? Luna didn't even belong to any faction, yet here she was, happily taking Andreas's side in front of everyone. Meanwhile, Andreas thought to himself that the fact no one dared to make a move against him, despite how wary they all seemed, showed just how important Luna's presence in the congregation truly was. He noted that the four factions were keeping each other in check. The leaders of these factions were Jester Reuben, isekai'd, and Morn Dworsky. Inwardly, Andreas reasoned that this was probably why none of them were making any rash decisions. He especially believed those from Jester's faction were holding back. They might have appeared calm on the surface, but in reality, he knew they wanted to kill him right away. As for isekai'd, Andreas noticed she had only sent Dragon and had not come herself. When his eyes landed on Fade, he was surprised to see him in person this time. He remembered losing count of how many times Fade had killed him back when he was still playing the game. Even now, Fade remained a complete mystery to him. Apart from knowing he was a faction leader and a warlock-level black mage, Andreas admitted to himself that he knew next to nothing about him. Suddenly, Morke called out Andreas's name. She demanded to know how he dared to show up so casually after all the trouble he had caused the last time. Andreas bowed respectfully and greeted her, but that only seemed to anger her more. She snapped that he clearly did not realize his situation and warned that inside this place she could bury him in the dark forever. Secretly irritated that Jester had not even informed his own underlings of the invitation, Andreas calmly replied that he was there today at the invitation of Jester himself. At that moment, the fat ass from earlier jumped up, pointed at Andreas, and shouted that, as Morsh had said, he should be judged immediately for defying the congregation. But the man suddenly froze, almost shitting himself, as he felt an immense and menacing aura rise behind him. The aura belonged to a Death Knight, and when everyone saw it, they realized there was only one person capable of controlling an undead of that level: Morn. When Morn revealed himself, Andreas reflected that he was the final of the four leaders and the mentor of Charon, whom Andreas had previously defeated. He wondered if Morn had come now to finally take revenge. Everyone knew Morn as the one who currently stood at the peak of necromancy. Morsh immediately stepped in front of Morn and demanded to know why he was defending Andreas. Morn simply told her to understand, saying that Andreas was like a pupil to him. Morsh, however, refused to accept that. She reminded him angrily that Andreas was the one who had snatched his goods. Morn only laughed in response, repeating that he had already said it was fine. Then, in a menacing tone, he asked if perhaps she harbored ill thoughts toward him for giving Andreas those goods. The attention of the room then shifted as Jester finally spoke, telling everyone to leave the matter there. He declared that Andreas was present as his guest. Morsh was left shocked, while Morn calmly dispawned his summons. He admitted that Jester was right, especially in front of so many important guests, and excused his earlier aggressive reaction. Luna quickly appeared by his side and affectionately called him Grandpa. She told him to take it easy and rest, which made Morn laugh as he reassured her not to worry. After that, Andreas stepped forward to approach Morn. He said it had been a long time, called him Master, and thanked him sincerely for helping him once again. Morn simply told him to think nothing of it. He explained that it was only natural to avoid unnecessary conflict. Andreas then lowered his head slightly and said he was sorry for what had happened to Charon. Morn, however, waved it off, replying that perhaps that had simply been another fate for Charon, and that Andreas should not trouble himself with guilt. At that moment, Jester approached the two of them. He greeted both Morn and Andreas, saying it had been a while. Andreas expressed his thanks for the invitation, while Morn replied that it was good to see him. Jester, however, said that it was he who should be thankful. He explained that despite the enmity still lingering between them, Andreas had accepted his invitation, which meant much to him. Without wasting time, Jester admitted that what he was about to say might sound abrupt, but he would get straight to the point. He looked directly at Andreas and told him to join his faction. Those words left everyone present stunned. Murmurs spread through the hall, the shock palpable. Andreas, however, quickly pieced together Jester's intentions. He knew that by drawing him into his faction, Jester could once again keep watch over the academy, which Andreas had disrupted by killing Kyla. At the same time, it would allow Jester to strengthen his own influence in the congregation by cutting off Andreas's ties with Salem. Jester then asked what Andreas thought of the offer, saying he believed it was a good one. Inwardly, Andreas scoffed, thinking Jester could have been more honest by simply saying he wanted him as his lackey. He admitted to himself this would definitely cause an uproar, but considering what was coming next, he had no choice but to respond carefully. Out loud, he said he was grateful for the offer, but explained that his plan was to form his own faction within the congregation. The entire room froze in disbelief. Eyes widened, voices rose, and several asked if he was serious. Suddenly, Luna shouted over them all, declaring that she is joining his faction. Jester stood there, still stunned, while Morsh erupted in rage, yelling that the congregation was not some kind of game. Even Morn joined in, stating that he was not certain forming his own faction was a wise idea. Jester then asked if Andreas understood the weight of his words. He explained that to establish a faction within the congregation, he would need to obtain a leader's ring, either by seizing it from someone else or by having it passed down to him. Realizing this was indeed the system, Andreas calmly replied that he understood, but admitted it did not seem like something he could accomplish right away. Morche immediately shouted again, furious that he continued to insult the congregation. She said she had even been willing to overlook what happened last time, but this was too much. Before she could continue, Jester raised his hand and interrupted her. Turning to Andreas, Jester made a bold proposition. He vowed in his own name that he would put his faction ring at stake. He declared that Andreas should fight Morche here and now, and if he managed to win, he would inherit Jester's ring. Morche was visibly shocked, unable to understand why he would go this far, but telepathically Jester spoke to her, telling her that by doing this he erased any excuse for Morn to interfere. He added that while Andreas was still only a boy, he had been in contact with Maximin, and if they could not claim him, then now was their chance to eliminate him once and for all. Inwardly, Morn realized this situation was dangerous. Morch turned to Andreas and demanded to know his answer. Andreas thought to himself that if he truly wanted to take control of the congregation one day, he would eventually have to walk this path. If it meant facing Morch now, he might just have a chance. Morn tried to intervene and stop it, but Andreas cut him off. With composure he said it was an exceptional offer, and refusing it would be nothing but rude. A menacing grin spread across Morch's face. She told him to step outside, promising that she would carve into his body exactly how formidable the congregation was. The duel was set to be fought in front of the entire congregation. No matter the outcome, the rules were clear. Any retaliation or unfair treatment outside of the fight would not be tolerated. Morch, however, kept taunting him. She mocked that there was no Salem for him to run to this time, and Morn was forbidden from interfering. She asked if he could still act so boldly without their protection. Inwardly, Andreas admitted that he didn't truly know the full extent of Morch's strength. She might not be at the level of a warlock, but she was certainly far stronger than Karen or Kyla. Out loud, though, he smirked and asked if she was finally done yapping. Her face twisted with rage, and she immediately attacked. Feathers sharper than blades flew at him like projectiles as she shouted, demanding how he dared to taunt her. Andreas, however, managed to block every feather. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The congregation members were stunned that he had stopped Morch's opening strike. Morch grinned, clearly amused, and told him to do his best to stay alive until her anger burned out. Inwardly, Andreas studied her attack carefully. Those feathers weren't ordinary. They were as tough as steel. No, tougher dot stronger than he expected. He realized she wasn't an opponent he could take lightly. Still, he reminded himself that he couldn't reveal his entire hand here. He needed to handle this cautiously. In a blur, Morch dashed toward him, mocking him further. She asked if something was wrong or if he was too afraid to move. Her strikes came again, swift and relentless, but Andreas blocked them. She pressed closer, sneering, asking if perhaps he was underestimating her. Inwardly, Andreas was calm, planning. Now that she had finally moved within range, it was time. He summoned Nickel, who appeared silently behind Morch. His hand was limited, but if she rushed in too confidently, believing she had already won, he could end this quickly. Nickel struck, unleashing an explosive attack that rocked the battlefield. Dust and smoke erupted, and the audience gasped in shock. Andreas narrowed his eyes, wondering if Nickel's strike had finished her off. But as the smoke cleared, it was revealed that Morch had blocked the attack with her wings. Slowly, her expression darkened. She muttered that she knew it. Andreas was far too dangerous to be left alone. Then her body began to change. Her wings stretched wider, her form warped, and her voice grew deeper. She started transforming before everyone's eyes. Nickel launched another strike, this time joined by Andreas himself. The combined assault shook the ground, sending another massive explosion across the arena. But Morch endured. When the dust lifted, she was no longer in her human form. Before them all stood a monstrous black crow, massive in size, its eyes glowing like burning coals. She roared like a beast, the sound so powerful that the crowd covered their ears in pain. And then, out of nowhere, another figure appeared, Timur. The Tiger King materialized and drove a devastating punch straight into the giant crow's skull. The impact reverberated across the hall, and the members of the congregation erupted in shock as they recognized the undead. Morn, watching from afar, was impressed. He realized Andreas had reanimated the Tiger King Timur with near-perfect mastery, a feat not easily achieved. Meanwhile, Andreas was cautious. He wondered if Timur's attack would be enough, but the crow's ominous energy told him otherwise. He quickly ordered Timur to dodge, and it proved to be the right call. Morsch unleashed a storm of razor-sharp feathers that tore through the surroundings, even slicing into Timur despite his quick retreat. Knowing it was too dangerous to keep them exposed, Andreas commanded Nickel and Timur to return to the undead realm. Morsch, however, sneered Dot. She shouted that she would not let him surrender without her permission. Andreas stared back and replied that she didn't need to worry because he had no intention of surrendering. Suddenly, energy surged around him. The air grew heavy as an otherworldly aura wrapped itself around his body. The system's voice rang out. "The soul of the great warrior of Baiatra has descended." Andreas stood firm, cloaked in the raging aura of the Orc Lord. Andreas dashed toward Morhi and unleashed a fierce strike. She managed to block, but he didn't stop there. He pressed forward with a flurry of rapid slashes, each one sharper and faster than the last. To everyone's shock, his blows began to leave marks on her. The spectators stared in disbelief, whispering among themselves, wondering if he was really a mage at all. His movements resembled that of a fearsome swordsman, his precision and skill far beyond what anyone expected. Suddenly, Morhi's wings stretched wide. She opened her beak and began charging a massive beam of energy. With a deafening roar, she launched it directly at him. Andreas moved instantly, dodging at the last moment, and then closed the distance between them. The speed of his approach surprised her, but before he could strike, she curled into a ball and then burst open, releasing a storm of razor-sharp feathers. Andreas locked in Dot. His eyes began to glow as the feathers approached. In that instant, he saw the paths of every single projectile, the perfect routes he needed to take to survive. He knew exactly how to evade them all. And so, step by step, he did just that. Inwardly, he acknowledged what this was, the state of an aura master. Yet even as he danced between death itself, his body began to break down under the strain. Blood spilled from his mouth as he coughed, his muscles screaming. Still, he refused to stop Dot. He told himself he wanted to stay in this world just a little longer, to feel its weight a little more. That determination fueled him. In a final burst, he charged directly at Morsch. The crowd erupted in shock as he struck head-on, his attack devastating enough to deal heavy damage. Then everything went black. Andreas woke to the sound of his own coughing. He lay on a bed, his body wrapped in bandages, jolting upright. At that moment, the system appeared before his eyes. It announced that his swordsmanship talent had been upgraded to extraordinary, and that the requirements had been met to trigger an evolution. Confused, Andreas wondered where he was, but the system continued, declaring, "Andreas Cromwell's talent, swordsmanship extraordinary, rate of evolvability 100%, evolution available immediately." Before he could react, a voice interrupted. It belonged to Jester, who had entered the room quietly. Seeing Andreas's wariness, Jester reassured him not to be alarmed, saying he had no intention of harming him. Andreas, still catching his breath, asked if he had lost the duel. The answer came in the form of memory. The flashback replayed the final moments of the fight. Everyone in the congregation had been left wide-eyed and slack-jawed as Andreas's strike landed, causing Morsch to bleed heavily. She was stunned that he had pushed her this far. But despite her wounds, Andreas had collapsed first. With a cruel grin, she decided he couldn't be left alive, and prepared to finish him off. Before she could deliver the final blow, however, a massive explosion erupted between them. Debris flew everywhere, forcing Morsch to shield herself with her wings. Dust filled the hall. Dot. When it cleared, she saw who had intervened. It was Morn Dot. He had summoned 2 Death Knights, their towering forms standing protectively in front of Andreas. His voice echoed through the hall as he declared, "That is enough. From this moment forward, if anyone seeks to harm Andreas, I will consider it an act of war against me." Luna then stepped forward, her tone equally menacing. She placed her hand firmly on Andreas, making it clear she shared the same sentiment as Morn. Morher shouted back furiously, asking if Morn had lost his mind. She demanded if he was truly willing to make the congregation his enemy over that brat. But then, to everyone's astonishment, Morn did something none had expected. He removed his ring, the symbol of a faction leader, and declared that he was passing it to Andreas Cromwell. He stated that from this moment on, he would join the Cromwell faction. The hall fell into silence, stunned by the decision. Back in the present, Andreas was still processing what had happened. He was shocked that Morn had truly gone that far. Jester broke the silence. Dot. He admitted he had never expected Morn to act in such a way, and because of that, he wanted to make one final offer to Andreas. Jester leaned closer and asked Andreas if he would consider uniting their factions. Andreas let out a tired sigh and asked why Jester was so fixated on him. He reminded him that he even went so far as to send Morsch to duel him. Jester's response caught him off guard. He said it was because they shared the same goal, the wrath. The wrath, unlike the more controlled greed or the tireless sloth, was different. It was a deadly sin that had taken the form of a human child. Born as the son of a northern barbarian chieftain, the child was doomed by fate. Failing to escape it, he was abducted and met a tragic death at the hands of the greedy emperor. Andreas inwardly explained that enraged by the death of their chieftain's son, the barbarians had launched a desperate resistance. The empire underestimated them and suffered heavy losses, but in the end, not a single barbarian survived. Of all the deadly sins, wrath was the most steeped in blood and tragedy. The emperor had sacrificed the wrath in order to seize its power, but Andreas knew something Jester didn't. He had decided to extract that power without letting wrath die. He had thought this decision would buy him time. Clearly he had been wrong. Jester then asked him directly what he thought of his offer. He reasoned that since their goals overlapped, it would be far simpler if they joined forces. Andreas, however, replied calmly. He asked what Jester would say if he told him that wrath was not his true goal. Inwardly, Andreas wondered if Jester had been monitoring his actions as he hunted the deadly sins, or if he was merely fishing for a reaction. He couldn't tell which it was. Noticing Andreas's silence, Jester nodded slowly and said he would take that as a rejection. Andreas apologized, but Jester brushed it off, saying there was no need. He reminded him that the choice was his to make, but with choice came regret. With those words, he disappeared. Left alone, Andreas sat in thought, his mind turning to wrath. He remembered that the emperor should have been the first to move after Bloody Dan's death, the man who had kidnapped Wrath. In the original plot of the game, Jester had no interest in Wrath, so why was he after it now? A troubling thought struck him. Could Jester be working with the emperor? If so, then every move Andreas made could already be exposed. He realized he would have to be even more cautious of Jester than before. Suddenly the door burst open. Luna rushed in with Morn at her side, her face lit up with relief when she saw him awake. She told him how glad she was that he was alive. Morn followed, saying he too was pleased to see him well. Andreas shifted his gaze to Morn and said he had already heard from Jester what had happened. He asked Morn directly what he had done. Specifically, he asked about the ring and about Morn declaring himself part of Andreas's faction. Morn pulled out the ring, holding it in his hand. He told Andreas to take it, declaring that it now belonged to him. He explained that in Andreas he saw the possibility of a new era. Luna encouraged him as well, telling him to accept it. So Andreas did. He took the ring with both hands and thanked Morn sincerely. Inwardly, he thought to himself that with this ring as his stepping stone, he would one day take over the entire congregation. Meanwhile, in another location, Imp received the report of what had taken place. When she heard that Morn had handed his ring over to Andreas, she chuckled and said it seemed senility was finally catching up to him. Then she asked about the overall outcome of the congregation. Her subordinate replied that while the animosity toward Andreas Cromwell remained, things had shifted. Perhaps because of the strength he had shown in his duel against Morsch, they no longer displayed their hostility as openly. Eike found this development amusing. She added that what made it even more interesting was the fact that Luna Pendragon had chosen to side with Andreas. Eike leaned back with a sly smile. She remarked that it was a shame she had missed such an interesting spectacle, saying she should have attended the congregation this time. Her eyes narrowed with curiosity as she added that she would love to meet Andreas one day. Meanwhile, Andreas was walking alongside Morn and Luna. The three of them moved through the blizzard, and Andreas asked where exactly Morn was taking them. Luna, equally curious, pressed the same question. Andreas remarked that Morn had only told them to follow him, but he had never once explained the destination. Morn finally spoke. He said that truthfully he had been impressed by Andreas's undead during the duel. Yet after observing them carefully, he found that his defenses left something to be desired. Andreas knew he was right. He had noticed the same weakness himself. Morn then continued, saying that was precisely why he thought it would be useful to introduce Andreas to a skilled blacksmith. Andreas was a little surprised when he heard the words blacksmith. Morn explained that the blacksmith was the one who made the equipment for his undead, the same gear used on his death knights. Andreas was shocked that someone was skilled enough to forge weapons for death knights, so he asked if Morn was talking about the arcane smith Taraula. Morn was impressed that Andreas even knew the name and said yes, adding that Taraula might be an eccentric who chose to live in a harsh place like this, but his skill was impeccable. While they crossed the snowy land, a pack of wild wolves attacked them. Morn summoned some creatures that easily started eating the wolves alive. Andreas was stunned, thinking to himself how effortless it was for Morn to kill wolves that even a mid-level black mage would struggle against. He found Morn fearsome. The man might look gentle, but he was without a doubt the strongest necromancer he had ever seen. To break the silence, Andreas walked up to him and asked how long he had known the arcane smith Taraula. Morn said he first met him around 50 years ago, basically before Taraula became known as a maker of magic swords. The first time Taraula came to him, he was just an ordinary grief-stricken dwarf. Andreas asked if Taraula had been the one to approach him first, and Morn said yes. Then Morn asked if Andreas understood what that meant. Andreas said it must mean Taraula had lost someone dear to him. Morn agreed, saying only those struck by terrible misfortune or those who had lost someone dear would seek the help of a necromancer in a world this harsh. Andreas thought to himself that it was like Baron Boleric, who he had helped before. After a while they spotted a cabin with a light glowing inside. Luna pointed at it and asked if that was Taraula's home, and Morn confirmed it. Meanwhile, back at the academy, more specifically at the swordsman training grounds, Ivy was training Luis by sparring with him and giving him instructions on how to move and what to fix. Luis was being pushed back again and again, thinking to himself that Ivy was like an iron wall. She told him that was enough for the day. Luis sat on the ground exhausted, but still asked Ivy if they could do one more round after a break. That made Ivy wonder what was wrong with this kid. She thought he was just some typical top student. She never expected him to get this strong in only a few days. She then remembered when Andreas came to her and told her to train Luis while he was gone, saying Luis would be worth her time. Ivy found it annoying that Andreas had a better eye for people than she did. Out of nowhere, Luis told her he heard she was now an aura master and congratulated her. Since she was not good at handling compliments, she coughed and said it was nothing and hardly a big deal. Luis told her that could not be true since he heard only a handful of people passed the screening. Still acting strange, she claimed not passing screenings like that was just ridiculous. Luis kept going, saying she was also the youngest person to ever pass it and that he respected her a lot. Having enough praise for the day, she told him that was enough and to raise his sword already. Luis got ready to keep training, but Ivy suddenly asked how he even knew Andreas since he looked like he had nothing to do with him. Luis, confused, said he thought she was helping him because she and Andreas were close. That remark annoyed her. Luis quickly said sorry, but still asked why she was helping him then. She replied that she got curious, since Andreas had recommended him so highly. Luis then remembered the promise Andreas made to him that they would spar next time. Now he assumed Andreas might have asked Ivy to spar with him in return for that promise. But before he could think more, Ivy put her training sword away and said that remembering Andreas's head made her lose her mood. She added that they would continue tomorrow. Luis was confused by that decision, but he still thanked her sincerely for making time for him. She smirked and told him to do his best, or she would quit as soon as he bored her, then she left. Meanwhile, back with Andreas at Taraula's place, it seemed Taraula already knew why they were there and had completely refused. Andreas thought he would accept right away since the request came from Morn. Morn told Taraula not to act like that and said he was making him lose face. But Taraula said he only agreed to Morn's past requests because it was him. He said, to be blunt, lowering himself to craft equipment for mere undead went against his pride, especially if it was for the undead of some brat he barely knew. He added that any decent blacksmith would agree that no one wanted their craft in the hands of a worthless nobody. Andreas felt insulted, but he held himself back, since Taraula was the Empire's finest blacksmith. He wondered if there was any way to convince him. Taraula kept talking, saying that at least Morn's Death Knights being on a whole different level was some small consolation. Then he told Andreas that maybe he would have better luck convincing another blacksmith instead. That was when Andreas summoned Nickel. He grinned and said that if Taraula didn't want a worthless nobody holding his weapon, then what about Nickel? Maybe an undead with an ego would interest him. Taraula was surprised to see a phantom rank undead with an ego, but said he was sure Nickel was nothing compared to Morn's undead. Andreas was left speechless for a moment, but Morn cut in and said Nickel was actually quite fascinating. Then he made a proposal. If Andreas could prove his undead strength against one of his, maybe Taraula would consider making a weapon for Nickel. Both Andreas and Taraula were surprised by that suggestion, while Luna got excited to see a fight. Andreas asked Morn if that wasn't going too far, but Taraula accepted right away and said he had no issue with that deal. They went outside, and Morn told Andreas there was no need to hold back and that he could come at him with everything he had. Andreas said he would do his best. Morn then remarked that Nickel looked ready and summoned his own undead. He pointed at it and said its name was Ruderon, one of the Aura Masters Morn had personally killed. Morn told Andreas that the difference in strength between a phantom and a death knight was like night and day, but after what he saw from Nickel a few days ago, he could not help expecting to be surprised again. The fight started with Ruderon delivering a clean vertical slash at Nickel, cutting him in half, but Nickel's body suddenly turned ghost-like, making the blade pass through without damage. He used that moment to counter-attack, but even though Ruderon was huge, he was fast enough to respond. Their clash caused a shockwave that blasted snow everywhere and sent both Nickel and the snow flying back a fair distance. Morn said Nickel kept grabbing more of his interest, especially after seeing him turn ethereal like a ghost, which explained how he survived that first attack. Morn then asked Taraula what he thought, reminding him that he even used his best Death Knight for his sake. He pointed out that a phantom holding its own against a Death Knight was rare. Just surviving one hit was already insane, so he assumed this would make Taraula admit Nickel had real strength. Taraula stayed quiet. Andreas glanced at him and thought to himself that dwarves were known to be stubborn, but this one was on a whole different level. He turned his attention back to the fight and thought that the evolved Nickel was doing well, but if things kept going like this, he would lose. Morn suggested ending the match, saying he was worried Nickel would get badly damaged if it went on. He told Andreas that another chance would come again anyway, but Andreas refused and said he had already promised to do his best, so he had to stand by that. In his head, he admitted Nickel was losing so far, but that was only if nothing changed. Right then, Andreas used Sloth on Nickel. Everyone felt the sudden rise in power as aura burst out around Nickel. Morn was shocked, wondering if Nickel was actually using an aura technique. Without knowing what was about to happen, he told Ruderon to brace himself. Both undead started aura farming, and Ruderon moved first with a slash. Nickel followed with a clean vertical strike of his own. Their blades met, and the impact was so strong the spectators had to cast magic shields to protect themselves. They clearly didn't shield enough, because Luna got blasted backward. Andreas panicked and ran to her, asking if she was okay. Luna, dizzy from spinning, said she was fine. They looked back at the battlefield and saw Ruderon standing there looking untouched. Andreas wondered if Nickel had lost. Morn said that was enough, and Andreas looked sad, thinking this meant the plan failed and maybe he had underestimated a Death Knight. But then Morn started laughing and said Andreas got him this time because Nickel had actually won. He pointed out that Nickel had sliced off Ruderon's arm cleanly. Luna saw it and shouted, "Amazing!" happy that he won against Morn. Morn snapped his fingers and healed Ruderon instantly. He said he had been wondering what tricks Andreas had up his sleeve, but did not expect anything like that. Andreas was shocked inside that Morn repaired the Death Knight's arm with just a snap. He thought to himself that Morn really earned the title of strongest Necromancer. Finally, it looked like Taraula was interested. He said he still found it hard to believe a phantom took down a Death Knight, and on top of that, it was an Aura Master too. Then he said he was starting to get curious about what other undead Andreas had. He told him he would start working after he saw the rest. Andreas thanked him excitedly, and Luna jumped in, saying she also wanted armor for herself. Suddenly, Taraula noticed Andreas's sword and asked where he got it. Andreas said it came from an acquaintance. Taraula said it was interesting and asked to examine it. Andreas agreed and handed it over. Taraula looked at it and said it was marvelous, explaining that it was made with techniques impossible to pull off today. But he added that something unknown was sealing its power. Morn asked Taraula what he meant by an unknown power. Taraula replied that it was probably the power of a god. He explained further that the sword was definitely sealed by the power of an ancient god. Meanwhile, at Andreas's house, Salem, still in his girl form, was struggling to believe that the book of the ancient god actually existed. Andreas had told Salem where the book was located in exchange for Salem letting Lucia return to her home. Andreas's sister spotted Salem approaching and greeted her. Salem asked if she was Cromwell's housemaid. Amy said no and introduced herself as the sister of the head of the house, Andreas Cromwell. She then asked who Salem was. Salem said she came to repay a debt she owed Andreas and told Amy to take her to him. But before anything else happened, Salem got blasted back by someone. Salem got mad and cursed, demanding to know who did that, thinking to herself that she could not even sense the attacker's presence. The one who struck was Maximin. He told the vampire and Amy to stay back. The vampire asked why he did that, since they did not even know if the woman was a guest. Maximin said there was no way someone hiding their identity was a guest, then demanded to know who she was. Salem snapped back that if he wanted to know, she would tell him. The vampire commented that their guest seemed pretty strong. Maximin agreed and drew his sword, pointing it at Salem. He said she was strong enough to make him pull out his blade. That was when Salem recognized the sword as the traitor executioner. She relaxed and asked if he was Maximin. Back at the Academy's training hall, Louise and Viviane were sparring while Ivy watched nearby. Ivy thought it was unbelievable. She admitted in her head that Louise had improved after getting some special guidance, but Viviane had gotten even stronger again. She remembered Viviane always had talent since her first year, but her biggest weakness was her poor control over her emotions. After the Boleric incident, Viviane suddenly started controlling herself much better. That led Ivy to wonder if Andreas was the reason. During the match, Viviane thought to herself that Louise was strong, while Louise also noticed that her attacks were getting stronger and stronger, thinking he would break his wrist if he lost focus. They clashed again, and the impact made both of them slide back a few steps. Viviane did not give him time to breathe and rushed at him with another powerful swing. She did not plan to stop there and was ready to follow up, but Ivy called for them to stop at the perfect moment. Ivy walked up to Louise and told him he was going to lose his head if he kept blocking half-heartedly like that. Then she turned to Viviane and thought her sword strike just now looked like she had unleashed aura. Ivy smirked and sighed to herself, realizing her record as the youngest aura master might be broken soon. Suddenly, Andreas's voice drew their attention. Viviane was the happiest to see him. Andreas complimented her growth, and Ivy immediately scolded him for dumping Louise on her without asking, and then disappearing. Louise said he heard Andreas had asked Ivy to help coach him and thanked him. Viviane, on the other hand, was secretly thrilled that Andreas had praised her. Andreas told Louise he seemed to have gotten a lot stronger in a short time. Then he pulled out a sword and told Viviane it was a gift for her, explaining that he happened to meet a skilled blacksmith. Viviane, nervous and flustered, said there was no way she could accept it, pointing out that he had already given her a necklace the other day. But Andreas still handed her the sword and said he had it custom-made based on her sword style and physique, so if she didn't take it, it would just be a useless hunk of iron to him. He added that it was made of a special material and could keep its sharpness without any maintenance. Viviane thanked him, and Louise told her to give the sword a name. She thought for a moment, and then called it Eternal Oath. Andreas said it was a fine name, and told her he hoped she would use it a lot. Ivy cut in and said that after all the trouble he put her through, didn't he have something for her too? Meanwhile, Louise looked at the sword and thought that just from a glance he could tell it was high quality. Andreas answered Ivy by saying, didn't he introduce Louise to her? After hearing that, Ivy suddenly looked like she needed the FBI called on her, because why was she blushing? She then glared at him and told him that just because she helped him once didn't mean he could joke like that. Andreas was confused and said he meant Louise had received the high-level training he needed from her, and since she took pride in her reputation as an educator, this was a chance to teach a talented student who might become an aura master, so he figured that was the perfect gift for both of them. Ivy realized she had misunderstood. Andreas asked if he was wrong, but she told him to shut up and said they were done for today. As she was leaving, Louise told her that to him she was the best gift he could get. Ivy started blushing again, shocked by how blunt he was. Louise then turned to Andreas and asked if he had time to spar for real now. Andreas said fine, he might as well since he was here. But before anything else, Andreas got a notification on his tablet. He checked it, and his whole mood dropped. He suddenly looked scared or worried and told Louise he was sorry, but something urgent came up, and he could not duel today. Later that day, Andreas snuck around near his house because the message had said they had his sister and were waiting for him there. He wondered what was going on. He remembered Isabel and Maximin being there, so he thought maybe they were attacked by people from the congregation, or maybe the Emperor. As he slowly opened the door to peek inside, his eyes went wide with shock and confusion. He saw Maximin, Isabel, and Amy sitting calmly, while Salem was there too, laughing and saying he knew Andreas would show up all ready to fight. Andreas stood there confused, and Salem kept laughing, saying Andreas's face looked like someone threw a brick at him. Maximin said they did not do anything. and Amy told Andreas to explain himself. Andreas apologized and said he would explain everything. Time passed as Andreas finished explaining everything. Amy said she never imagined he was involved in something that dangerous. Salem told her not to worry, saying that despite how Andreas looked, he was actually quite capable. He even solved Maximin's long-standing problem. Andreas said that he invited Isabel and Maximin there, so their presence made sense. But then he turned to Salem and asked why he was there. Salem froze for a moment because he assumed Morn had already explained it. He then said that Morn told him to protect Andreas. Andreas was confused, so Salem said yes, explaining it was because Andreas caused a huge mess at the congregation. Now a whole lot of people were aiming for his head. Salem added that he also appreciated the scripture Andreas told him about, and above all, he had heard that Jester was already moving openly. Word was that Jester had found Wrath. Meanwhile, somewhere in a snowy region, a man had just been killed. Looking closer, many bodies were scattered around, and the one responsible was Jester. Jester turned to his subordinate and told him to prepare a highly confidential letter for the Emperor. The man asked what he should write. Jester said to write that they had secured Wrath. Later, Jester had Wrath, who was just a kid, frozen in some kind of spell that stopped him from moving. Jester commented that it was interesting that the boy had been crying moments ago, but now he was glaring with murderous intent. He said that was exactly what he expected from Wrath. Jester mentioned the boy was the son of Kyrak, chieftain of the barbarians, and then asked the kid if he was scared. The boy grinned and said not at all, claiming his father would come soon and beat everyone up. Jester said he respected his bravery and decided to give him a reward. He pointed at the boy's chest and used some kind of magic that caused intense pain. Jester told him to enjoy it and said he would make full use of his power. Back at the academy, Vivian, Diane, and Luis were walking together. Diane asked why Vivian looked so lonely, but she assumed that it was because a certain someone just had to leave again, even though it had already been days since they last saw each other. She was talking about Andreas. But then Luis noticed a crowd forming and realized those people were members of the Imperial Knight Corps. Diane agreed and wondered what they were doing at the academy. Luis said it did not look like anything good. Diane agreed, saying this was a first. Vivian picked up her tablet and took a picture. Back at Andreas's place, Salem told him that Jester even had Wrath now. Andreas thought to himself that this was expected. Jester had been watching his reactions the last time they spoke. Jester probably had ties to the Emperor. That was why he could move freely within the Empire. Andreas had originally thought killing Bloody Dan would delay the Northern War, but now it had only made things worse. With the Emperor and Jester joining forces, Andreas's territory, estate, and possibly even Amy were at risk of danger. He then told Salem he had a formal request to make. Andreas asked Salem if he can stay in his territory for a while. Salem said yes, that was his plan from the start. Otherwise, Andreas would not be able to move around in peace. Andreas thanked him for accepting the request, but just then a notification popped up on his phone. He checked it and saw a message from Vivian. She had sent him the picture she took of the Imperial Knights at the Academy. Andreas realized what it meant. It was happening. They had finally come to mobilize the Academy's students for the Northern War. Salem noticed the change in his expression and asked what was wrong. Andreas said there was probably an impending war. Amy was shocked, and everyone focused on him. Andreas told Amy to listen carefully. He said that once the war began, they would be forced to follow the laws set by the Count's house. That meant they had to provide the Empire with 5 knights and 500 soldiers. Since they had none, they would have to pay a war tax instead, 1 billion wills every month. Salem laughed and called them money-grubbing cunts, saying this was exactly why he became an anarchist. Andreas said it would be hard to raise that much money, even with the profits from the trading group he was running. He explained that was why he was planning to make a new potion, but Amy interrupted him and said it was possible. She explained that she would have to put the business expansion on hold, but she could manage 1 billion a month. Andreas was impressed that she grew her trading group that much on her own, but he told her that might only work for a few months. If the war dragged on for years, it would get harder and harder. He reminded her that many trading groups had gone bankrupt because they ran out of funds to keep operating. That was why she should continue running her business the way she had been. Maximin then turned to Andreas and said that Evan told him they had met in the Great Forest. If that was true, he asked Andreas if he had met the elves of the Great Forest. Andreas looked confused, so Maximin explained that when he visited the elves' territory in the past, he saw many valuable items that were not found in the Empire. Andreas was stunned, and Amy got excited. She said if they could make a deal with the elves through the trading group, but she was cut off by Salem's laughter. Salem said Maximin was such a tease and was skipping over what kind of people the elves were. Isabel then explained that it would be difficult for humans because elves were extremely hostile towards humans. Andreas still said he would try. If they managed to open trade with the elves, they could monopolize their market as the only humans involved. Maximin stood up and said he and Isabel would leave for now, saying they were not done cleaning the garden. Andreas was stunned by what he heard, but Isabel told him to just continue his conversation and then left with Maximin. Still surprised, Andreas asked Amy if she really had them cleaning the garden. She nervously said it was not like she forced them. They insisted and would not take no for an answer, so she had no choice. Salem burst into laughter. He couldn't believe she turned a vampire and the strongest man in the empire into a gardener. Then he joked that maybe he should become a butler too, and kept laughing. Later, near the entrance of the great forest, Andreas was walking when a group of intelligent raccoons spotted him. They labelled him an outsider right away. After sniffing the air, one of them noted he was human and told the others to inform someone named Malcour that their target had been found. Meanwhile, Andreas was thinking to himself that the war could no longer be avoided. The chance to erase its cause had passed a long time ago. No matter what, he had to prepare for it. While his thoughts wandered, the raccoons started threatening him, telling him to get out of the forest or they would kill him. Maximin had told Andreas that a raccoon dog named Malcour, who understood human language, might lend him a hand. So Andreas shouted to the raccoons that he was here under Maximin Cronel's instruction to speak with Malcour. Instead of calming down, the raccoons jumped around him with weapons in their hands and called him brave for stepping into their forest. One said it had been ages since he got to flex his muscles. Another said he heard human flesh was tender. A third said they would drag him to Malcour. Andreas ended up tied up and asked if there wasn't another way to do this, saying he didn't intend to harm anyone. But they yelled at him to shut up and told him it was a rule to tie up any outsider they saw for the first time. Andreas reminded them he already said he came with Maximin's introduction, but they told him nothing would happen until Malcour gave permission. Andreas was annoyed and wanted to beat them up, but he forced himself to be patient. Causing a scene would only bring more problems, and he needed this for the money. Inwardly, he thought that even now, Jester might have already gotten his hands on the wrath, and what came after would matter even more. He had to reach the elves' territory no matter what. Unknown to him, an elf was watching the scene from behind a tree. After they arrived at Malcour's place, Malcour told Andreas to sit. Andreas had already introduced himself and said he was a black mage sent by Maximin, and that his name was Andreas Cromwell. Malcour commented that for a black mage he carried a pretty impressive sword, calling him quite an odd one. Then he introduced himself as Malcour, the eldest elder of the village. He apologized for the behavior of the villagers, even though Andreas had travelled all this way. After that, he asked what brought him here. Andreas said he wanted to know how to get to the World Tree. The raccoons who were listening asked if he was crazy and suggested they should just kick him out of the village. Andreas turned to Malcour and asked why the raccoons were reacting like that, as if he said something forbidden. Malcour explained that the elves had been acting strangely for some time. He said the World Tree was located at the heart of the Great Bayatra Forest inside their territory. Until recently, those reclusive elves refused to interact with other races, but now they had started moving around outside their lands more often. Andreas thought about it and said inwardly that in other games, elves usually had a good view of humans, but in Deadly Sins they did not. Suddenly, a raccoon rushed into the room and urgently called Malcour's name. Malcour asked what was going on, and the raccoon said that several elves had appeared outside. There were about 6 of them, stopped by the raccoon guards. When Malcour went to greet them, the elf leader said it had been a while. Malcour asked what brought him here. The elf apologized for the sudden visit and said they had received a report that a human had come to the village. Malcour confirmed a human had indeed arrived, then reminded the elf that he remembered him turning a blind eye in the past when someone powerful like Maximin came through. That seemed to anger the elf for a moment, but he regained his composure and said the situation back then was different. He added that turmoil was brewing outside the great forest, and tensions were rising between the Empire and the northern barbarians. For a human to come here at a time like this was suspicious, so they were taking precautions. Malcour asked if that was why the elf was pointing his arrows at him in his own territory. The elf scoffed and inwardly called him a damned sharp old raccoon, but Malkor warned him not to act thoughtlessly. Out of respect for his friendship with the elf elder Hogan, he would overlook this once. The elf bit his lip, and then told the archers to stand by outside the village. Andreas stepped out of the house and asked the elf if they had been keeping an eye on him since he arrived. The elf said he had a question for him. Inwardly, Andreas recognized him as a member of the Wind Knights, known as the Second Star of the Wind, Sael Mora de Precilia. Sael asked Andreas what his purpose was in coming here. Andreas said he wanted to know how to get to the World Tree, and since an elf was already here, he asked them to show him the way. In his head, he said that mentioning negotiations for a trade deal would only cause trouble right now. Sael put a hand to his forehead and asked if he heard correctly. He said he heard humans were preparing for war, which meant they were a threat to the Great Forest, but Andreas still expected them to guide him to their sacred sanctuary. In other words, Sael said, Andreas must not mind being beheaded right here and now. He said that in a menacing tone. Sael then said that since this was not elf territory, but raccoon land, they would avoid causing trouble for other races and let him leave with just a warning. He added that Andreas would only cause problems if he stayed longer. Inwardly, Andreas said Sael was the one who started the commotion, and now was acting like he was doing Andreas a favor. Like hell he would let that slide. So he loudly said, "How weird," and in his head added that this was to secure exclusive trade rights with the elven city of Lastyria. Then he said out loud that he didn't think they were done talking yet. Without even waiting a second, Sael swung his blade at Andreas, almost beheading him, but stopped right before the strike landed. When Malkor saw that, he shouted at Sael, asking what he thought he was doing. Sael replied that he thought he already said that was his final warning. Andreas grinned and said he must have missed that part. Then he swung his blade up to meet Sael's blade and said he had his own reasons for not backing down. Inwardly, he added that he still needed equipment and the world tree seeds. Malkor was impressed by Andreas's swordsmanship and wondered if he was Desgrun's disciple. Sael, on the other hand, was furious and called him an insolent human, saying that even after showing him mercy, Andreas still dared to act like that. Andreas replied that Sael's reaction was a bit too drastic just because he was cautious about human wars. He went on and said all he did was mention the World Tree, yet Sael overreacted. It made him wonder if something had happened to the World Tree. Those words seemed to shock everyone who was present. Sael said Andreas talked too much, but Andreas started to say that even if this was raccoon territory, before he could finish, someone cut him off and told Sael to wait. All eyes turned toward the voice. It came from an elf girl who asked to be allowed to speak with Andreas. Sael raised his voice and told the elf girl, Ymir, to stop acting foolish. He asked if she really planned to let a human who might be a threat to Lastyria come in. Ymir replied that Andreas had noticed the same strange signs they sensed, so he might be able to help them. She said it made no sense for Sael to get rid of Andreas because of some old rule. Sael stayed stubborn and said no meant no, and that they were leaving. Ymir then spoke with a firm voice and said that as the next High Priestess candidate, she was officially inviting Andreas Cromwell into the elven land of Lastyria. After that, Andreas got on their ride and followed them. When he arrived, he was amazed. Back when he played the game, the place already looked majestic, but seeing it in real life was on a whole different level. Ymir told Andreas to wait for a bit while she went to get approval from the council. Andreas said all right, and remembered that he still didn't know her full name. She said her title was Sixth Star of the Wind, but he could just call her Ymir. Saeli cut in and told her that the elders hadn't given full approval yet, and that she shouldn't talk to Andreas more than needed. Andreas thought to himself that the elders were probably as stubborn as Sael, so things might not go smoothly. Meanwhile, back in Raccoon City, Malkor was thinking about something. One of the raccoons asked what was wrong and if he was worried about Andreas. Another raccoon looked confused and said he didn't get why Malkor would worry about a human. He said he thought he was finally going to get a chance to eat human meat. Another raccoon laughed and asked if he wasn't vegan. Malkor laughed a bit and said he wasn't worried about Andreas. After all, Andreas had been trained by Deshrun and was close friends with Maximin. The raccoon from earlier agreed and said those two were tough. But the other raccoon pointed out that he never even fought them, so how would he know how tough they were? Malkor said that wasn't the problem. What bothered him were Andreas's words. He wondered if something had happened to the World Tree. The World Tree was the heart of the Great Forest, so he hoped nothing serious was going on. Back in Lasteria, Andreas could feel the stares from the elves like they were burning a hole through his head. He wondered why, since he had done nothing wrong. Ymir then came back and told him they got the approval, which surprised him because of how fast it happened. She apologized for making him wait, but he said it was fine, and admitted he didn't expect the approval to come that quickly. Ymir said she was surprised too. The elders were unsure at first because he was an outsider, but they agreed after hearing he already knew about the World Tree's situation. Still, they only approved on the condition that her clan would go with him and watch over him. Andreas was grateful and thanked her respectfully, saying he would make sure not to trouble her. Then he asked if they could head to the roots of the World Tree now. Before Ymir could answer, an elder walked over and asked if he was the human who spoke about the World Tree. The elder said he would be joining them. Ymir recognized him as Elder Fugen. Andreas knew the name too, and thought that having someone so important nearby would make it hard for him to move around freely. Ymir said she couldn't trouble a respected elder like him, but Fugen asked if his presence was a problem for Andreas. He told Andreas to remember that it was only because of his approval that Andreas was allowed to travel to the World Tree. After that, he told him to follow him right away. As they made their way toward the great tree, they walked through a beautiful garden. Andreas said he had never seen plants like those before. Ymir told him it was their prized tea plantation. That made Andreas ask if the fine tea he drank back at the manor had been made from those plants. She said yes, and explained that they loved tea so much, they drank it 12 times a day. Andreas grinned and thought to himself, so that's how it is. As they got closer to the World Tree, Fugen said the tree was a sacred being that had lived alongside the elves for ages, but lately they had been sensing a strange and unsettling presence coming from its aura. Because of that, it would be reckless to enter the World Tree without care. He said that with Andreas's arrival, they had decided to do a proper investigation. Andreas thought to himself that, in other words, they were using him as bait. Still, if he couldn't enter the tree, it meant the corrupted World Tree event had already started, and Lasteria would end up destroyed. By the time anyone realized it, it would be too late. It wouldn't be easy, but if he handled this event, he could earn the elves' trust and finally secure the trade deal. After walking for a while, they reached the roots of the tree. Andreas thought he knew it was big, but he didn't expect it to be that massive. Then he suddenly felt a strange presence nearby. He wondered if a third party he didn't know about had interfered with the tree's corruption. Fugen turned to Andreas and said that since he was a foreigner from beyond the great forest, he should understand something. By guiding a mere human to the World Tree, Ymir had put her clan's honor on the line, but as an elder, Fugen was adding one more condition. Andreas thought to himself that he knew something like this was coming. Fugen started summoning his blade and said that before he entrusted Andreas with the heart of the great forest, the World Tree itself, Andreas had to prove he was worthy. Fugen Cordal de Claxia was known as the elves' strongest warrior and an aura master, so Andreas hadn't been expecting something at that level. He asked if this was some kind of test. Fugen said he wouldn't deny it, since it was necessary now. Ymir spoke up and said this wasn't part of what they discussed in the elders' meeting, but Fugen said this decision was his own, and their survival was on the line, so he asked her to understand. Andreas stepped in and told her it was fine. He said he didn't want people complaining later, so he decided to accept it. Later, Andreas and Fugen stood face to face with their weapons ready for a while. Ymir asked why they were just standing there. A man next to her said they were both waiting for an opening and that Andreas must be pretty skilled. Meanwhile, Fugen wondered to himself if Andreas was reading the flow of energy. It looked like he had the basics down. Fugen had expected him to charge in recklessly. Since he didn't, Fugen decided to give him a little bait. Andreas took the chance and rushed at Fugen with impressive speed. Fugen thought Andreas had fallen for it, so he quickly turned and followed up with a slash that cut Andreas in half. But unlucky for Fugen, the one he sliced was only an afterimage. Even so, he was fast enough to block Andreas's counterattack right after. He smirked, then summoned a stone golem that sent Andreas flying back. Andreas wondered why Fugen was using spirit magic. From that short clash, Fugen guessed that Andreas was Deshrun's student. Since that was the case, he said he would take the fight more seriously. Andreas was impressed he figured that out with only a few exchanges. That also meant if Fugen knew about Deshrun, then he also knew how to counter Andreas's sword. Andreas thought that if he brought out his undead here, he would only make these stuck-up elves angry, so his only option was to use that feeling he had before. The state of an aura master. It was the same sensation he felt when he fought Morka. Suddenly Andreas vanished from Fugen's sight. Fugen realized he was trying to get into his blind spot. When he turned and saw Andreas again, it looked like Andreas was multiplying. There were a bunch of him in the air, which shocked everyone watching. Fugen said only one of them could be real, but Andreas thought to himself that he would handle this fight in his own way, not like his master Deshrun. Fugen's eyes went wide when all the versions of Andreas attacked at the same time. In that moment he realized they were all real. To protect himself, he had to pull the golem in front of him to block the huge strike Andreas unleashed. When the dust began to settle, Fugen said it looked like all that did was stir up dirt, since Andreas split his strength. He added that if that was Andreas's full strength, he wouldn't let him enter the world tree. He spotted Andreas's silhouette and dashed toward it, then slashed. But that was only a decoy. Andreas used it to get behind Fugen and was ready to end the fight. At the last second, the golem saved Fugen again by blocking the strike in time. Fugen turned to Andreas and said it seemed he had underestimated him. Suddenly, the core of the golem glowed red and fire began to rise. The earth golem wasn't an earth golem at all. It was an inferno golem, and Andreas only now realized it. The golem opened its mouth, full of built-up flames, and blasted the fire straight at Andreas. Ymir saw it and looked worried, covering her mouth with her hands, while the elf next to her looked happy. Fugen stared at the fire and wondered how Andreas managed. Then Andreas's voice cut through the silence. He summoned huge earth shields and slammed both the golem and Fugen with them, which made the watching elves start to worry for Fugen instead. After a moment, Fugen's voice came from behind the broken shield. He said that was surprising and admitted Andreas fooled him. Then he broke free of the earth shield. He added that it looked like Andreas wasn't a swordsman after all. Andreas said he couldn't believe Fugen used fire right in front of the world tree. Fugen replied that it seemed his will to win made him lose judgment, and he apologized. Andreas then asked if Fugen still wasn't going to accept him. Fugen stayed quiet for a moment, then turned to the elves and told them to open the pathway for Andreas. Ymir walked up to Andreas and asked if he was hurt. She told him to rest first, but he said he was fine, and there was no need to worry. Andreas walked toward the entrance and said he was going in. Ymir told him the paths inside the world tree were complicated, so they would go with him. But Fugen told her that she was the next High Priestess candidate, and they couldn't risk putting her in danger. He said he and Forum would accompany Andreas instead. Suddenly Sail shouted for them to wait. He said that he, the second star of the wind, Sail Mora de Praekilia, had been ordered by the Council of Elders to join the investigation of the world tree. Andreas thought that Sail and Forum must be getting impatient, since they were the ones responsible for harming the world tree in the first place. Then the original sin spoke to Andreas, telling him to back out or he would regret it. Andreas was confused for a moment, but then a system notification appeared. It said the seed of the god-killer had detected a god's presence, the presence of the one who carves time upon the stump. It also said it couldn't control the power, since the divine relic was too strong, and it couldn't collect any traces. Andreas grinned and said this was a surprise. Since the original sin bothered to show up, it meant something was happening here that wasn't under its control. But the original sin answered that what was attacking the world tree was still part of it. Since it had chosen Andreas as its host, it couldn't just ignore him. Andreas thought to himself that if it was a part of the original sin, then it had to be one of the deadly sins. He already had greed, while wrath and sloth were with the congregation. The emperor held pride, and lust was with the vampire. That meant the one hiding here had to be gluttony. Before fading away, the original sin said he'd been warned. Andreas wondered how serious this was if even the original sin was trying this hard to stop him, but his thoughts were cut off when they arrived. Fugen told him this was the heart of the world tree. They started moving around, and Fugen asked what he thought since they had been there for a while. He asked if Andreas could sense anything. Andreas said he didn't feel anything yet, and that they would have to go deeper to figure it out. Fugen told him that going deeper meant getting closer to the vital core of the tree. Even if this was what the Council of Elders decided, the idea still didn't sit well with him. Sail agreed loud and clear. He shouted that they didn't even understand what was happening yet, so starting an investigation based on some human's so-called intuition was ridiculous. He said they should throw the human out before they angered the world tree. Andreas wanted to insult him, but held back. Instead, he said that if the world tree, the one that governed the great forest, was in danger, then humans wouldn't benefit either if something went wrong here. Sale took that as an opening and said that, in other words, Andreas was helping them only for human peace. He claimed that human goodwill was nothing but selfishness. Andreas said that was a huge leap in logic and thought to himself that there must really be something down here. Then he said he would take responsibility if his intuition turned out to be wrong. After hearing that, Sale grinned and asked if he was saying he was willing to bet his life. Andreas said sure, why not? Andreas also said that if there really were problems with the world tree, he would take Sale's life for it. Fugen cut in and yelled at both of them to stop. Another elf suddenly tapped Andreas on the back and told him to calm down. He said this was a serious matter for them, so Andreas should forgive them if they got a little worked up. Andreas looked at the guy and wondered why this man was acting so familiar with him. Then he said out loud that he wasn't taking this matter lightly either. The man said he knew and then pulled his hand off Andreas. It turned out touching him was his plan, since he left some kind of bug on Andreas's back. The man then said they should head down a little further, and Sale agreed. They started marching with a grin on Sale's face. After a while they reached the very bottom, and Fugen asked Andreas if anything had caught his attention. Andreas thought to himself that the place was amazing, like there was an entire ecosystem inside the tree. He looked around and said there was a faint trace of impure mana. That made him wonder, because that faint trace only appeared after he argued with Sale earlier. He said out loud that it was faint, but still concerning. Sale then asked if they really needed to search every route here, and Fugen said it was going to be difficult. Andreas was about to say they should start looking, but out of nowhere he was attacked. Both he and Fugen were shocked, while Sale and the other elf were grinning. The roots wrapped around Andreas from all sides. Even when Fugen tried to help, the roots stopped him too. Andreas was getting pulled in and swallowed, and he cursed inside his head, realizing they got him. Once Andreas disappeared from sight, Fugen asked in confusion what was happening. Sale said maybe Andreas had angered the world tree. He asked if it wasn't well known that the world tree always removed foreign elements. Fugen said something like that only happened once every 1,000 years, and the world tree wasn't this easy to upset. Then the other elf joined in and said, maybe the world tree sensed the humans' evil intentions. Fugen thought about it and told himself that Forum might have a point. What just happened did seem like the world tree's immune reaction. Meanwhile, Sale thought to himself that thanks to Forum putting Gluttony's lava on Andreas's back, the world tree reacted at the perfect moment. With Fugen seeing it with his own eyes, there was no way he would suspect anything. Soon the world tree's immune reaction would go wild, and once that happened, they could move forward with their plan. Then the whole place started shaking, and Sale shouted that the roots were starting to move. Fugen said he was going to look for Andreas, and told the rest of them to go back and report what was happening, and to call the best knights here. Forum said a meeting of the Council of Elders was required to mobilize them, and told Fugen he should return instead. He said Fugen should go back with Sale, and he would search for Andreas himself. Sale said that was the best choice, and Fugen had no other option, so he agreed. But before leaving he told Forum that if he found Andreas, he should not attack him. Forum grinned like a maniac and said, "As you command." Meanwhile, Andreas found himself somewhere inside the tree. As he slowly opened his eyes, he wondered where he was. He cursed at the original sin for never showing up when it actually mattered. A system notification popped up saying he had entered the interior of the world tree's immune system, and that a time distortion had been detected. It calculated that time here moved 1,440 times slower than outside. Andreas thought that if one day passed outside, he didn't even know how many years that would be in here. He also wondered if he was still inside the world tree at all. He knocked on the wall, and it was as hard as stone. It seemed like he was completely trapped. Another system message appeared, saying the spawns of gluttony had sensed his presence, and their numbers were countless. Andreas was confused at first, but then he saw many red eyes glowing in the dark, staring at him. He started fighting the monsters, but no matter how many he killed, more kept coming. He summoned Milene to help him, and while fighting, he wondered how many days had passed already. The worst part was the creatures kept coming one after another, and they ate their dead to increase their numbers even more. He came with plenty of potions, but who knew how long they would last? He needed to find the exit soon. A system message showed up saying his swordsmanship was undergoing gifted evolution. The chance of it working reached 31%, and the system asked if he wanted to evolve it. Meanwhile, outside the tree, Fugen told the knights that for decades the world tree had shown signs of strange behavior, and today they were investigating with a human who had sensed those same signs. But the tree had swallowed him. That shocked and confused the knights. Fugen said they would figure out why it happened. Sale then butted in and shouted that there was no problem, and that the tree punished Andreas because it sensed his evil intent. Fugen told him not to make random assumptions, but Sale asked if he hadn't seen it with his own eyes. Fugen said that until they knew the real reason, they shouldn't make rushed claims. Amir also spoke up, saying that was right, and that she didn't sense any malice from Andreas. Everyone started talking over each other, but Fugen told them all to calm down. He said to stick to their original plan, to fully investigate the inside of the world tree, find the human, and uncover the cause of the anomalies. Sale was angry. Inside his head he said he didn't know how much longer until it happened, but there was no way they would find the cause in time. Suddenly, the ground began shaking, confusing everyone. Sale, on the other hand, grinned and thought to himself that the tree's downfall had finally begun. 100 years ago at the World Tree, the elves were fighting off orcs. Sale had been there and asked the others if they were all right. One of them said it looked like they cleared the perimeter and confirmed the orcs had retreated from the eastern forest too. Sale told them to bring the wounded back to Lastyria and said the rest should follow him to chase down the orcs. Just then, the High Priestess told him to stop his pursuit and said there should be no more sacrifice. Sale knelt and begged the High Priestess to let him destroy the orcs. He said if they let those orcs walk away, they would only come back as a threat later. But the priestess told him there had been a prophecy. She reminded him that the world tree protects the balance of all life in Baiatra. Later that night, Sale was with Forum. He thought to himself that it was absurd for people as strong as them to be controlled by a prophecy. In his mind, real balance meant keeping order through hierarchy, where the strong stood above the weak. He believed that if they kept clinging to such lazy ideas, they'd be wiped out soon. Right then, he swore he would create a new order in Baiatra. Meanwhile, somewhere else, a raccoon was getting tickled by Aisha, who said it was cute. The man with her told her their client would arrive soon. At that moment, that client, Sale, showed up and asked if they brought what she promised. Aisha set the raccoon down and turned to them. She said she never expected the ones trying to kill the world tree would be the beautiful elves themselves. Sale told her to stop talking and hand over what she promised. She laughed and joked that he had a long life, yet was so impatient. Then she told the man with her to give Sale what they brought and to handle it gently. She told Sale to toss it deep into the tree roots. After taking it, Sale asked if that thing could really kill the tree. She told him not to underestimate it and said it would be amazing when it grew. He asked what the price was. She said she had never tasted an elf before, so the man behind Sale would do. Sale got irritated, but Aisha said she was only kidding. She said even she wouldn't bother with some old man whose age she couldn't figure out. She told him to just raise the nimblebug. That was enough as payment. Sale, still doubtful, asked if she was sure. She said yes, and added that since he planned to feed it the world tree, if not for both him and Forum, she'd be too scared of the elven elders to even come here. Sale then asked when they should return it to her. She said when the time came she would come and get it herself. Until then, they should use the pendant she gave them to train the little bug properly. Sale said they had a deal and started leaving. She said he was boring and wondered if she should at least take the raccoon dog back with her. Dragon asked why, and she said it was cute. Forum then asked Sale if they could trust that human woman's words. Sale said no. Forum asked why, and Sale said the sinister manner coming from the box was trustworthy enough. Forum said fine and that he would stand with him until the end. Back in the present, Forum was still inside the tree, pretending to look for Andreas. He thought to himself that it had been 7 hours since the immune system swallowed Andreas. By human time standards, Andreas should be close to death by now, so Forum figured he should be able to find the body somewhere near the immune system's outlet. There were a lot of bones scattered around, and he also spotted a spawn of gluttony. He didn't understand why its corpse was there, since those creatures always ate their own kind without leaving remains. That made him wonder what was going on. Then, out of nowhere, a bright light appeared in front of him, and he wondered if it was Andreas's doing. The light didn't stop, because it wasn't just light. A massive explosion went off, brightening the whole area and blasting everything away. Everyone was sent flying, even Forum. He was confused as he tried to catch his breath, panting and wondering what was going on. But those were his last thoughts, because his head was sliced off by Andreas, who appeared right after dealing with him. Andreas, with his hair now extremely long, wondered how much time had passed outside. He needed to hurry. Before all of this, when he was still trapped inside the World Tree, he had thanked God that he was a necromancer. Thanks to his undead soldiers, he could at least take short breaks. As time went on, and he killed more monsters, the evolution rate of his gifted swordsmanship kept rising. It eventually reached 73%, and he decided that was enough to accept the evolution. But even if his swordsmanship evolved into genius level, it didn't guarantee he would escape this place. The moment he clicked yes, intense pain shot through him, and he started screaming. He wondered if Angela went through this much pain when he evolved her. All his evolutions so far had felt easy compared to this. He never knew it could be this bad, and in that moment he realized he had done something horrible to Angela. The pain overwhelmed him, and he fainted. While he was unconscious, his summons protected him. System notifications appeared, saying his gifted swordsmanship was evolving into genius swordsmanship, and it would take 240 hours. After that time passed, another notification appeared saying the evolution failed, so a penalty would be applied. It warned him to brace himself for the shock. Andreas started screaming again in pain, and a message appeared saying the evolution probability had reset to 0. The shock of pain woke him up. He looked around, confused and breathing heavily, wondering how long he had been out. He slowly stood up and admitted he'd been too impatient and ended up wasting a lot of time. He drank a potion and said that from now on he would take it slow until it reached 100%. He told his undead they did a good job, then said it was his turn to fight. After that, he started cutting down as many gluttony spawns as came near him, then rested while his undead protected him and kept repeating the process. He continued like that until the evolution probability finally hit 100%. Since it was his turn fighting and his undead were resting, he summoned Nickel and Timer back and left the rest to them. Then he clicked yes to start the evolution again, while hoping he'd find the answer to escape this place after evolving. The time for the evolution started at 370 hours and began ticking down. His undead guarded him the whole time. After many long hours, the evolution to genius swordsmanship completed. By then, his hair had grown very long, and he stayed there aura farming. Once he was done, he picked up his blade and began chopping through every enemy around him with ease. Even though his slashes were strong, they still weren't powerful enough to destroy the roots around him. He thought no wonder brute force couldn't break through. So instead, along the path of his sword, he focused all his aura into a single stroke. That attack sent us back to the present moment, where he killed Forum. When Andreas got out, it felt like he had been trapped in there for more than 4 years, and out of everyone he could have run into first, it had to be Forum. He originally planned to beat Forum half to death before finishing him off. But who knew what Sale was doing right now? He had to hurry. Meanwhile, outside, the elves felt the ground shaking and looked around in confusion. Ymir told Fugen they needed to find Andreas before it was too late. But Sale cut in and told her that the House of Farallum should take responsibility for what happened, and he told her to watch her words. Then he announced to everyone that as captain of the Lasteria Knights, he was ordering the elite soldiers to return to Lasteria together with Fugen. Fugen yelled back, demanding what Sale was talking about. He said even if they chose not to save Andreas, the investigation of the World Tree still had to continue. Sale replied that Forum was risking his life to search for Andreas. So if what Fugen said was true, and there was a serious problem with the World Tree, how could they be sure it wouldn't attack elves too, just like it did to Andreas? After saying that, Sale thought to himself that things were going well. Once Foram hid Andreas's body, he could blame everything on Andreas and win the people over to his side. And when the World Tree finally died, he would take gluttony for himself. Suddenly, the roots of the tree began rising and slamming into the ground like giant whips. Everyone was confused and terrified as the World Tree's roots rampaged all around them. They had no choice but to dodge as best they could or get crushed. Sale was stunned and wondered if this was Gluttony's doing, but it was way too early for that to happen. Right now, he needed to use the pendant he got from Eicher to control Gluttony, but when he looked at it, he saw it was cracked, and then it crumbled to pieces in his hand, leaving him completely confused.
If you've made it this far, please step forward and press the button. Now, open your eyes, step forward, and push the button.
Now, I want you to do something else for me. Please press the subscribe button.
Come on, give it a try.